The sugar had to last your whole family for days, not just a few hours. The meat sitting in your refrigerator was not something you picked because it looked good. It was what the government allowed you to buy, with small paper stamps they had given you. This was life for millions of ordinary people during the Second World War. Not soldiers in trenches or pilots in the sky, but mothers and fathers and children and grandparents, simply trying to live their normal lives while everything about food had quietly become something else entirely. Rationing changed something so basic, so automatic, that most people had never thought about it before. Let these stories come to you softly now, one at a time, as we will talk about 101 facts of food rationing that change daily life, like pages turning slowly in a quiet room. You do not need to be anywhere else tonight. The world outside can wait. Everything is still. Everything is calm. And the story is just beginning. Fact number 1. Bacon was the very first food to be rationed in Britain, and the date it happened, the 8th of January 1940, marks one of those quiet moments when the texture of daily life changed almost overnight, and changed for good. What makes this fact so striking is not really the food itself, but the feeling it produced in homes all across the country. Bacon had been part of the British working class breakfast for generations. It was cheap, filling, always available, and it carried the kind of warm, familiar meaning that certain foods gather quietly over many years of daily use. When it was suddenly rationed, most families did not simply feel inconvenienced. They felt something shift. It was a physical, sensory confirmation that the war was real, that it was going to last, that it was going to reach into the most intimate corners of daily life in ways that even the official declaration of war, 4 months earlier, had not quite managed to make fully real. Government surveys taken shortly after rationing began recorded a notable change in the mood of ordinary civilians. Not panic, just a quiet, settled gravity, a recognition that things had changed in a way that would not quickly reverse itself. Bacon of all things had made the war feel true. Fact 2. Before a single ration book was printed or a single queue formed outside a butcher's shop, the British government had already been quietly planning the mechanics of civilian food rationing for nearly 2 years. The system that came into effect in January 1940 was the result of careful, detailed work by civil servants who had studied the failures of the First World War rationing system and were quietly determined not to repeat them. During the First World War, rationing had been introduced late and unevenly. The wealthy had been able to work around the restrictions through restaurants and private supplies, while working-class families had carried the full weight of scarcity almost entirely on their own. The people designing the Second World War system had seen this clearly, and they built it specifically to avoid it. They created mechanisms designed to spread the scarcity as fairly as possible across society, regardless of income or position. Whether they fully succeeded is debatable. The system was far from perfect in practice, but the intention itself was genuinely significant. For perhaps the first time, a British government had designed a major domestic policy with fairness at its very center, not as an afterthought, but as the point. The ration book in this sense was not simply a tool for managing food. It was also a quiet political statement about who mattered and how much. Fact 3. Sugar rationing hit British households in a way that went far deeper than the simple inconvenience of using less sweetener in cooking. In the years before the war, sugar in the British diet was not a luxury. It was woven into the fabric of daily comfort in ways that are easy to miss from a modern perspective. The average British person in 1939 consumed significantly more sugar each day than current health guidelines would recommend, and much of it went into the 2 or 3 cups of tea that punctuated the working day as reliably as the hours themselves. Tea with sugar was not simply a preference for millions of working-class British people. It was a ritual, a comfort, a small daily pleasure that the demands of hard physical work and domestic life had made feel almost essential. When sugar was rationed to 8 ounces per person per week, later reduced to 8 ounces per fortnight, the adjustment required was not only practical, it was deeply psychological. Letters and diaries from those early rationing weeks return again and again to the specific quiet indignity of unsweetened tea, described in terms that seem almost out of proportion until you understand what people were really mourning. It was not the sugar itself, it was the comfort it had carried, the small, reliable daily pleasure that the war had gently but firmly taken away, along with so much else. Fact 4. Germany introduced food rationing in August 1939, a full month before the war officially began. That detail alone tells you something important about how the Nazi government thought about the relationship between food security and civilian morale. The German rationing system was elaborate, deeply hierarchical, and built explicitly around the regime's racial beliefs. German civilians received the highest allocations. Foreign workers brought to Germany through forced labor programs received considerably less. Jewish civilians in Germany received reduced rations before being removed from the system entirely. Food allocation had been turned into a direct instrument of racial hierarchy. The German rationing system was not simply an economic response to wartime scarcity, it was an active expression of the regime's broader ideology. In occupied territories, the situation was even more deliberate. Ration allocations for civilian populations in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union were set at levels the German authorities knew were not sufficient for long-term human survival. This was not an administrative mistake or an oversight. It was a calculated policy, a reflection of how much, or how little, the regime valued the lives of the people living under its occupation. In Nazi hands, food had become something else entirely. It had become a weapon. Fact 5. Meat rationing in Britain produced a transformation in the national diet that nutritionists at the time found genuinely surprising, and that researchers have continued to find interesting ever since. When red meat became scarce and expensive, British households turned to alternatives they had rarely used before. Offal, rabbit, fish, vegetables, foods that had previously been considered inferior or simply outside the ordinary weekly routine. The enforced broadening of the British diet produced health improvements that nobody had planned for and nobody had quite expected. Infant mortality rates fell during the war years. Certain diet-related conditions declined. The combination of reduced meat and sugar consumption, more vegetable intake driven by the Dig for Victory campaign, and the relatively fair distribution of available nutrition across society produced a population that was by several measurable standards in better average health than before the war. This was deeply ironic. A population living under sustained physical danger, psychological stress, and severe material hardship was nevertheless showing real improvements in nutritional health that peacetime abundance had never managed to produce. The lesson was uncomfortable for a society that had always associated prosperity with plenty. But it was real, it was measurable, and it quietly challenged some of the most fundamental assumptions about what food abundance actually does for the people who have it. Fact 6. Ration books in Britain were color-coded by age and circumstance, and that simple detail made the system both more equitable and more emotionally complex than a single uniform allocation would have been. Adults received buff-colored books. Children under 5 received green books, which gave them priority access to certain foods, especially orange juice, cod liver oil, and milk, considered essential for early childhood development. Pregnant women and nursing mothers received additional allocations. The visible difference between ration books meant that a trip to the shops involved a quiet, public display of your household circumstances. It laid bare, across the counter and in the queue, a level of personal and family information that peacetime shopping had never required. Shop owners and their staff came to know their customers in a new and intimate way. They knew who had recently had a baby. They knew who had lost a family member and had a book to surrender. They knew who was managing alone and who had the relative ease of a full household allocation. The ration book transformed the ordinary commercial relationship between shopkeeper and customer into something that carried a quality of genuine personal knowledge. It was a small but real change in the social texture of communities, one that was felt most clearly when the war ended and the comfortable anonymity of ordinary shopping slowly, quietly returned. Fact 7. Queuing became one of the defining social experiences of wartime civilian life in Britain and across occupied Europe. Around the simple act of standing in line, an entire culture developed, with its own unwritten rules, its own social rhythms, and its own quiet emotional textures. A queue outside a butcher's shop in wartime London was not simply a line of people waiting for food. It was a community forming temporarily in the cold. A place where news was exchanged, where friendships were maintained, where the social life of a neighborhood expressed and renewed itself under pressure. The etiquette of the queue was taken very seriously. Jumping the line, pushing forward, or trying to claim more than your rightful share was met with a social disapproval that carried genuine force. But queues were also places where solidarity showed itself in small and practical ways. Someone holding a spot for a neighbor who had to attend to a child. Someone sharing quiet information about where a particular item was still available a few streets away. Someone offering a gentle word to a woman who had received terrible news but was standing in line anyway because the children still had to be fed. The queue was cold and unglamorous and frequently frustrating, but it was also, in its own modest way, a daily practice in exactly the kind of social patience and mutual consideration that communities need most when everything around them is under strain. Fact 8. The American rationing system, introduced after the United States entered the war in December 1941, was built on a fundamentally different model from the British one. Rather than fixed weekly allowances, it used a points system, giving American consumers a degree of choice that their British counterparts had largely lost. American households received books of points that could be spent on rationed items in whatever combination they chose, allowing each family to prioritize the foods that mattered most to them within their overall allocation. The system was administratively complex and required real public education to function, but it reflected a distinctly American assumption about individual choice and consumer freedom that the more prescriptive British approach simply did not share. American rationing also differed in its underlying material reality. The United States, as a food-producing nation of continental scale, was never in genuine danger of the nutritional crisis that threatened Britain during the worst phases of the Battle of the Atlantic. American rationing was, in a meaningful sense, more about fair distribution and national solidarity than about managing true scarcity. This distinction was not always visible to American consumers experiencing rationing for the first time. The frustration was real, but the underlying situation was significantly more comfortable than what was being endured simultaneously in Britain, occupied Europe and the Soviet Union, a difference that mattered enormously, even when it went quietly unacknowledged. Fact 9. Cookbooks became unlikely bestsellers during the war years as civilian cooks across Britain and America grappled with the practical challenge of making satisfying, nourishing meals from a dramatically reduced and unfamiliar range of ingredients. The British Ministry of Food published a series of recipe booklets designed to help housewives navigate the new culinary landscape. How to make a roast without meat, how to produce a cake without eggs or butter, how to stretch a small amount of protein across an entire week of meals for a family. These publications were practical documents, but they were also something more. They were an acknowledgement from the government to the people that the domestic labor of feeding a family under rationing was real, demanding, and worthy of support. The women receiving these booklets were not simply being handed recipes, they were being recognized, however imperfectly, as doing essential work whose skill and ingenuity was as genuinely important to civilian survival as any factory output. Recipe innovation during the war years produced some results that were genuinely impressive, and others that were memorably terrible. Mock bananas made from mashed parsnips and banana essence may be the most frequently cited example of wartime culinary creativity exceeding the outer limits of what any banana had ever consented to become. But the effort itself was real, and the recognition it deserved was real too. Fact 10. The black market for food operated in every country with a rationing system, and its character and scale differed significantly depending on the country and the severity of the underlying scarcity. In Britain, black market food trading was relatively small in scale and genuinely disapproved of socially. This attitude was cultivated deliberately by government messaging that framed black market purchasing as a form of theft, not from the government, but from your neighbors and from the war effort. Even so, the black market existed and was used, and its use was far from evenly spread across society. Wealthier households had greater access to restaurants, which operated under a separate and more generous regulatory framework. They also had private connections with farmers and food producers that less affluent families simply did not have. The ability to work around rationing was in practice linked to social and economic privilege in ways the system's designers had tried to prevent but could not entirely eliminate. In occupied Europe, the moral picture was entirely different. Black market food purchasing was not a matter of convenience or preference. In many cases it was survival. A family buying food on the black market in wartime Warsaw was not doing the same thing, morally or practically, as a wealthy Londoner dining out to supplement a ration that was already adequate. The black market meant something different depending on where you were standing and how hungry you actually were. Fact 11. Eggs became one of the most symbolically loaded foods of the entire wartime rationing experience in Britain. carrying an emotional weight that seems almost out of proportion until you understand the central place they had occupied in everyday pre-war life. Before the war, eggs were cheap, endlessly versatile, available year-round, and consumed in large quantities by virtually every household regardless of income. Rationing reduced the official egg allowance to approximately 1 fresh egg per person per week, and in practice, even that modest amount was frequently unavailable. The government's response was to introduce dried egg powder, imported from the United States under the Lend-Lease program. It was nutritionally adequate, but culinarily and emotionally a very poor substitute for the real thing. Dried egg could be used in cooking, but it could not be fried, poached, or boiled. Its taste and texture were distinctly inferior, in ways that even skillful cooks struggled to fully compensate for. The return of fresh eggs after the war ended was one of the most commonly cited symbols of post-war relief. That sounds trivial until you understand what it actually represented for the people involved. It was not simply an egg, it was the return of a small and deeply reliable daily pleasure that the war had quietly removed for years, and that people had genuinely, specifically missed, in a way they had not expected to miss something so ordinary. Fact 12. Bread remarkably was not rationed in Britain during the war itself. This was a deliberate political decision made by the Churchill government, on the grounds that bread represented too fundamental a psychological baseline of civilian life to be officially restricted without risking serious damage to public morale. The decision not to ration bread was maintained throughout the war years, despite considerable pressure on wheat supplies from German U-boat attacks on Atlantic shipping convoys. The irony is that bread was rationed in Britain after the war ended, in July 1946, more than a year after the fighting had stopped, when global wheat shortages and the demands of feeding displaced populations across Europe created a supply crisis that the wartime system had somehow managed to avoid. The post-war bread rationing was experienced by many British civilians with a particular and bitter frustration that even the wartime rationing had not always produced. At least during the war, there had been a clear moral reason for sacrifice. The post-war restriction felt less like a shared national effort and more like an administrative failure, and it was received accordingly. The introduction of bread rationing in peacetime proved politically damaging to the Labour government that implemented it. When bread rationing finally ended in July 1948, the relief was genuine and widely felt, speaking clearly to how deeply the 2-year restriction had been resented by the people who had lived inside it. Fact 13. Chocolate rationing affected the lives of children during the war in ways that shaped their relationship with sweetness and scarcity long into adulthood. Sweets and chocolate were rationed in Britain from July 1942, with the weekly allowance set at 2 ounces per person, roughly equivalent to a very small chocolate bar by modern standards. For children who had previously had reasonably free access to penny sweets and small bars as an ordinary part of childhood, the reduction was felt with a particular sharpness. Children developed strategies for managing their tiny allocation with a seriousness that adults found both touching and quietly amusing. They rationed their own ration. They saved it for specific occasions. They traded allocations with siblings. They learned very young the emotional discipline of deferring an immediate pleasure for the sake of a longer-term plan. Many people who were children during the rationing years described in later life a relationship with chocolate and sweets that retained a quality of heightened appreciation and occasional guilty excess that they traced directly back to those years of scarcity. When sweets rationing finally ended in February 1953, the last major food item to be derationed in Britain, the initial response was a surge of purchasing so intense that supplies were quickly exhausted and rationing had to be temporarily reimposed before things settled down again. Fact 14. Milk rationing introduced a formal prioritization of children and pregnant women that had significant and measurable effects on the health of an entire generation of British children. Under the system, children under 5 and pregnant or nursing women received priority allocations of fresh milk. This was part of a broader government effort to protect the nutritional foundations of early childhood, even within the severe constraints of wartime supply. The National Milk Scheme, introduced in 1940, provided free or subsidized milk to pregnant women and young children regardless of their families' financial circumstances. This meant the nutritional protection offered by milk was genuinely universal, not limited to those who could afford to pay. Researchers studying the long-term health of children born and raised during the British wartime rationing period found that this generation showed notably good skeletal development and dental health compared to pre-war children raised in poverty. Much of this improvement is attributed to the equitable distribution of milk under the rationing system. The wartime prioritization of milk for children was in retrospect one of the most effective public health interventions of the entire rationing period. It produced measurable benefits that outlasted the system itself by decades, benefits earned not through medical advances, but through the quiet, sustained effort of making sure the youngest and most vulnerable received what they needed, even when there was not very much to go around. Fact 15. Restaurants and hotels operated under a separate and considerably more generous regulatory framework than domestic rationing throughout the war years in Britain, and the social inequality this created was a source of genuine and persistent civilian resentment. While working-class households managed their weekly ration book allocations with careful precision, wealthier Londoners could dine in restaurants permitted to serve unrationed meals, subject only to a price cap and a limit of 3 courses per meal. The Savoy, the Ritz, and other luxury establishments continued operating throughout the Blitz, serving food that bore very little resemblance to what was available to families living a few streets away. The government's attempt to address this through the price cap, intended to keep restaurants from becoming exclusively upper-class preserves, was only partially successful. Even a capped price placed restaurant meals well beyond the means of most working-class families. The establishment of British restaurants, government-funded communal eating facilities offering simple, nutritious meals at a fixed low price, was a partial response to this inequality. They offered working-class civilians access to at least one daily meal outside the constraints of their domestic ration allocation. By 1943, there were over 2,000 British restaurants operating across the country, serving approximately 600,000 meals per day. It was one of the most significant expansions of publicly provided food service in British history, born directly from the unequal pressures of wartime and the quiet, persistent human need for something warm to eat. Fact 16. Vitamin supplements became a carefully managed and deliberate component of British wartime nutritional policy, representing a significant expansion of the government's direct role in managing civilian health. The Ministry of Food, working alongside the Ministry of Health, developed a program of free or heavily subsidized vitamin supplements targeted at the population groups most vulnerable to nutritional deficiency under rationing. Cod liver oil, rich in vitamins A and D, was distributed free of charge to children under 5 and to pregnant women. Concentrated orange juice, providing vitamin C, was made available at subsidized prices through welfare clinics. This result, alongside the evidence on milk distribution, contributed to a growing post-war political consensus. The government had demonstrated it had both the capacity and the responsibility to directly manage the nutritional environment of its most vulnerable citizens. That consensus would eventually find its fullest expression in the creation of the National Health Service in 1948, one of the quieter but most consequential legacies of the wartime food emergency. Fact 17. Farming communities across Britain experienced the war as a period of extraordinary and exhausting intensification. The government's desperate need to maximize domestic food production transformed the agricultural landscape and the lives of the people working it in ways that had very little to do with the rural imagery that wartime propaganda sometimes projected. The Ploughing Up campaign, launched in 1939, required farmers to convert grassland and other non-arable land to food production at a pace that was unprecedented, and that frequently outran the available supplies of labor, machinery, and expertise. The relationship between the Women's Land Army and the farming communities they worked within was not always straightforward, but it produced over the course of the war a remarkable set of social encounters between women who had never left a city and communities that had rarely seen an outsider, that changed both parties in ways that neither had entirely anticipated when they first arrived, and that neither entirely forgot when it was over. Fact 18. The Dig for Victory campaign, launched by the British government in October 1939, was one of the most successful pieces of domestic wartime communication in the entire conflict. It transformed the meaning and social status of vegetable gardening in ways that were both profoundly practical and quietly symbolic. Before the war, growing your own vegetables was primarily associated with rural communities and working-class allotment culture. Middle-class suburban households with ornamental gardens did not typically do it, and did not aspire to. The Dig for Victory campaign deliberately targeted this audience, reframing vegetable growing as a patriotic act, a form of direct personal contribution to the war effort. The campaign worked not only because it met a genuine practical need, but because it gave urban civilians, especially those who felt somewhat removed from the direct action of the war, something specific and manageable to do. Something they could do with their hands, their time, and their need to feel that they were contributing something real, however small, to the effort that surrounded them on every side. Fact 19. The introduction of the national loaf in Britain in 1942 was one of the most contentious and least popular food policy decisions of the entire rationing period, and the civilian reaction to it reveals something important about the psychology of managing food under wartime conditions. The national loaf was a wholemeal bread made from flour with a higher extraction rate than the standard white bread British consumers were accustomed to. The change was made to extract more nutrition and more volume from the available wheat supply. The British public was considerably less so. The loaf's darker color, denser texture, and slightly bitter taste were widely and vocally criticized. It became a focus for civilian frustration with rationing that was disproportionate to its actual significance. The Ministry of Food responded with a communications campaign pointing out the loaf's clear health benefits and urging civilians to embrace it as a contribution to the war effort. The campaign was met with the specific and determined skepticism that British consumers tend to reserve for being firmly told that something unpleasant is actually good for them. The national loaf remained unpopular throughout its entire existence, and was abandoned with considerable public relief when proper white bread became available again after the war. Fact 20. Lend-Lease. The American program through which the United States supplied food, equipment, and materials to Allied nations had a direct and significant impact on the daily diets of British civilians that is less often acknowledged than its military and industrial dimensions. Between 1941 and 1945, Lend-Lease deliveries to Britain included enormous quantities of canned meat, dried eggs, cheese, canned fish, and other foodstuffs that supplemented the domestic ration and helped prevent the nutritional crisis that the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic had been specifically designed to create. But the psychological significance of these deliveries was considerable alongside the nutritional one. Each shipment that arrived represented the outcome of a battle in the Atlantic, carried in ships whose crews had risked their lives to deliver it. Many British civilians were genuinely aware of this, and genuinely moved by it. A tin of Spam was not simply a tin of Spam. It was a small, edible piece of an alliance, a physical token of a relationship between nations that was quietly helping to determine the outcome of the war. Fact 21. Housewives during the war years were effectively conscripted into a second war being fought entirely in the kitchen. The demands placed on them by the rationing system were recognized, at least eventually by the government, as a form of skilled and essential wartime labor. The Ministry of Food's network of food advisors who visited community centers, factory canteens, and women's organizations to demonstrate rationing-friendly cooking techniques represented an unprecedented intervention by the state into the domestic sphere. These advisors, many of them trained home economists, traveled across Britain demonstrating how to make pastry without fat, how to produce a satisfying soup from vegetable scraps, how to stretch a small quantity of meat across multiple meals through careful preparation and creative seasoning. But the women who attended these demonstrations were not passive recipients of instruction. They brought their own considerable experience and ingenuity to each exchange, and the best sessions functioned as genuine conversations, women sharing practical knowledge under difficult conditions, learning from each other as much as from any official. Many of the recipes and techniques that emerged from these exchanges were genuinely creative, products of necessity applied to available ingredients with a resourcefulness that professional chefs working with full supplies would never have needed to develop. The wartime kitchen, as constrained as it was, produced some of the most inventive domestic cooking that Britain had seen in a very long time. Fact 22. Rationing in the Soviet Union operated under conditions so extreme that comparisons with the British or American systems become almost meaningless. Soviet civilians in besieged or occupied areas faced food allocations that were not merely austere but genuinely incompatible with sustained human life. Managing food became a matter of survival arithmetic rather than careful household budgeting. In besieged Leningrad, the bread ration for non-working civilians fell at its lowest point in November and December of 1941 to 125 grams per day. That is roughly equivalent to 2 thin slices of modern sandwich bread. And for many civilians, this was not a bread ration supplemented by other foods, it was the entirety of their daily intake. The bread itself was not ordinary bread. It was a mixture of flour, sawdust, cotton cake, and other extenders that gave it the necessary volume while reducing its actual caloric content below even the official figures suggested. People died of starvation on the streets of Leningrad in numbers that overwhelmed the city's capacity to collect and bury the dead. The extraordinary measures taken by ordinary civilians to extract nutrition from materials that in any other circumstance would never have been considered food at all represent one of the most extreme chapters in the entire history of wartime civilian experience, a testament to what human beings will endure and find ways through when there is no other choice available to them. Fact 23. Allotments became a genuine social institution during the war years in Britain, developing around themselves a culture of community, competition, and mutual support that extended far beyond their practical function as food production sites. Waiting lists for allotment plots, which had been modest in peacetime, stretched to years by 1941 as the Dig for Victory campaign generated more demand than the available land could immediately satisfy. The allotment sites themselves became spaces of remarkable social mixing. A factory worker and a bank clerk might tend adjacent plots, exchange advice about blight or slugs, and develop a friendship rooted in shared practical endeavor that the ordinary social divisions of British life might never have produced on its own. The competitive dimension of allotment culture was also real and sometimes fierce. The quality and productivity of a neighbor's plot was observed with an attention that combined genuine admiration with barely concealed rivalry. Showing produce at local allotment competitions became a source of community pride that the war had quietly elevated from a hobbyist's pastime into something that felt, in the context of the times, almost patriotically meaningful. Growing a better onion than the man 3 plots down was a small thing, but in a world where small things had become the primary texture of civilian life, it mattered in ways that were entirely understandable, and in ways that the people involved would quietly remember for the rest of their lives. Fact 24. Children's experience of rationing was shaped by emotional and psychological factors distinct from the adult experience in ways that researchers have only gradually come to fully appreciate. For children old enough to remember the pre-war years, rationing represented a specific and named loss, the absence of particular foods they had enjoyed before the war, and that they continued to miss with a clarity and a persistence that adults sometimes found touching, and sometimes found exhausting. For children too young to remember anything else, rationing was simply normality, the world as it was, with no pre-war baseline to measure the scarcity against. This generational difference within the child population produced some interesting social dynamics in school settings. Older children sometimes described the pre-war abundance of sweets or meat or butter to younger ones in terms that verged on mythology, stories of a world of plenty received by the younger children with a mixture of genuine fascination and mild disbelief. Children who grew up knowing nothing but rationing developed a relationship with food that was in some respects more psychologically comfortable than that of children who remembered plenty and mourned its absence. But they also carried into post-war life a baseline expectation of scarcity that shaped their behavior around food in ways that persisted long after the rationing had ended, a quiet inheritance from years they would never entirely leave behind. Fact 25. The fishing industry underwent a remarkable transformation during the war years that had direct consequences for the civilian diet across Britain and many other countries. Large portions of the pre-war fishing fleet were requisitioned for naval use as minesweepers, patrol vessels, and convoy escorts, significantly reducing the capacity for civilian fish supply at the same time that the demand for non-rationed protein was increasing sharply. The vessels that remained in operation faced the additional hazard of working in waters that were both mined and subject to air attack, making fishing not only economically difficult but genuinely dangerous. Despite these constraints, fish became one of the most important protein sources in the wartime British diet, precisely because it was not rationed. Whatever quantity was available could be purchased without ration book coupons. Fish and chip shops experienced a surge in popularity for exactly this reason, becoming in some communities the primary source of a hot, protein-rich meal outside the home. The government recognized the strategic importance of maintaining fish supply and made specific efforts to protect and support the reduced fishing fleet, understanding that the availability of unrationed protein was one of the key pressure valves that prevented civilian food frustration from becoming something more politically serious. The simple act of buying fish and chips in this light was also a small act of national resilience, ordinary and unremarkable, and entirely essential. Fact 26. Wartime food rationing produced a dramatic expansion of communal eating in Britain that reshaped the social landscape of both urban workplaces and civilian communities in ways that outlasted the rationing system itself. Factory canteens, which had been a relatively minor feature of industrial workplaces before the war, were expanded and formalized under government pressure into comprehensive meal provision systems serving millions of workers daily. The government recognized that a workforce receiving a hot, nutritious midday meal was a more productive workforce, and the expansion of factory canteen provision was framed as an industrial efficiency measure as much as a welfare one. But the social effects went beyond productivity. Eating together, sharing a table with colleagues across the usual workplace hierarchies, receiving the same meal regardless of grade or seniority, created a democratic texture of daily experience that many workers found genuinely novel and for the most part genuinely pleasant. The shared meal became a site of quiet leveling that the more formal structures of workplace life did not provide. A daily reminder that the war had created, at least in this small and practical domain, something closer to genuine equality of treatment than British working life had previously been inclined to offer. When the canteen system contracted after the war, many workers found its absence a quiet but real social loss, something small and unremarkable that had, without anyone quite noticing, made a difference. Fact 27. Honey took on a new and practical significance during the war years as sugar rationing reduced the availability of sweeteners for both domestic cooking and food production. Beekeeping, which had been a minority hobby before the war, expanded significantly during the rationing period as civilians and smallholders responded to government encouragement to develop alternative sweetener sources. The government provided subsidized equipment to new beekeepers and offered guaranteed purchase prices for surplus honey, creating an economic incentive that combined with the practical need for sweeteners to produce a modest but genuine expansion of the national bee population. For the individuals who took up beekeeping during the war years, the activity provided something beyond sweetener production. It was a form of engagement with the natural world that offered a particular kind of meditative relief from the anxiety and tension of wartime daily life. Several wartime diarists described their beekeeping as one of the most psychologically restorative activities available to them, a domain of activity governed entirely by natural rhythms and biological needs, rather than by the arbitrary demands of the war. The bees did not know there was a war on. They simply continued with what they had always done, in whatever weather came, without urgency or fear or grief. Spending time with them offered a temporary refuge from the knowledge that a war existed at all. And in those years, that refuge was worth a great deal. Fact 28. Point rationing in the United States created a new category of consumer decision-making that Americans had never previously been required to practice. The weighing of food choices not only against price but against the additional currency of ration points, which varied by item and required a form of household budgeting that many families found genuinely challenging. The Office of Price Administration, which managed the American rationing system, produced an extensive program of public education designed to help consumers understand how to use their allocations effectively. But the system's complexity meant that errors and confusions were common. Shopkeepers became informal advisors, helping customers understand which choices would stretch their points furthest and which represented poor value within the rationing economy. This second layer of consumer calculation, alongside the ordinary arithmetic of price and preference, changed the relationship between American households and their food shopping in ways that were small in any individual instance but cumulatively significant. Wives who managed the household food budget developed new skills of comparative calculation and strategic planning. These skills were recognized within households, if not always beyond them, as a genuine form of expertise. The management of ration points became in many American homes one of the primary practical expressions of domestic intelligence, a skill taken seriously, exercised carefully, and genuinely valued by the families whose comfort depended on it every single week. Fact 29. Wartime recipes for mock versions of unavailable foods represent one of the most fascinating and revealing documents of civilian culinary adaptation during the rationing years. Across Britain, the United States, and other rationing countries, food writers, government nutritionists, and ordinary home cooks produced an extensive repertoire of substitutes for foods that had become scarce or entirely unavailable. Mock cream made from margarine and dried milk. Mock marzipan made from haricot beans and almond essence. Mock duck made from lentils. Mock goose from a combination of vegetables and whatever fat was at hand. The creativity was genuine, and some of these recipes were surprisingly successful as culinary solutions to the problem of producing satisfying food from limited materials. Others were less successful, documented in wartime diaries with a candor that makes very clear the gap between the cheerful optimism of the recipe pamphlets and the actual experience of eating the results. The mock banana, made from mashed parsnip flavored with banana essence, appears in these diaries with a regularity that speaks to both its ubiquity and its consistent failure to adequately address the longing it was designed to satisfy. Food substitution, when it worked, demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of the human appetite. When it did not work, it demonstrated with equal and patient clarity that appetite has limits, that the mind can accept a substitute intellectually, while the body and the memory quietly register with great precision that this is simply not the real thing. Fact 30. The relationship between rationing and class in the United States was shaped by dynamics specific to American social geography and economic structure. Urban working-class families, who depended entirely on purchased food and had no access to private gardens, rural connections, or informal relationships with food suppliers, felt the constraints of rationing most directly and most completely. Rural families, by contrast, often had access to food sources entirely outside the rationing system: homegrown vegetables, backyard chickens, milk from a house cow, fruit from orchard trees, that gave them a meaningful cushion against the restrictions of the official allocation. This urban-rural divide in the experience of rationing was a source of genuine social tension. It found expression in congressional debates, in local newspaper editorials, and in the private conversations of urban housewives who understood clearly that the equality the rationing system promised was in practice considerably more theoretical than actual. The family that could supplement its official ration with home production was living inside a fundamentally different food experience from the family entirely dependent on what the ration book and the local shop could provide. The distance between these two experiences was one of the persistent and imperfectly addressed inequities of the American wartime food system, real and visible enough to those living inside it, and rarely acknowledged as clearly as it deserved to be. Fact 31. Tea occupied a position in the British wartime psyche that went so far beyond its status as a simple beverage that the government treated its supply as a matter of genuine strategic national importance. When tea rationing was introduced in July 1940, limiting each adult to 2 ounces per week, enough for approximately 2 cups per day, the response revealed how deeply emotionally invested British civilians were in this particular drink. Tea was not simply hydration or refreshment, it was the primary vehicle through which British social life expressed itself, the first thing offered to a visitor, the automatic response to any crisis, the daily rhythm that punctuated work and rest and conversation and grief and celebration with a reliability that had become fundamental to the texture of British life itself. The government understood this, and its communications around tea rationing were notably more careful and sympathetic in tone than those around other rationed items, acknowledging the genuine sacrifice involved rather than simply framing it as a practical necessity. Tea rationing was also one of the areas where informal sharing between neighbors was most commonly reported, families giving portions of their allocation to elderly neighbors who found the restriction most difficult, or quietly pooling their tea to produce a proper brew for a special occasion. Tea, in this sense, was not only a drink, it was a language through which British wartime solidarity expressed some of its most characteristic and most human dimensions. Fact 32. The wartime experience of food rationing in Australia differed significantly from the British experience in ways that reflected Australia's position as a food-producing nation with a very different relationship to supply and scarcity. Australia introduced rationing relatively late, clothing rationing in 1942, and food rationing limited primarily to butter, meat, sugar and tea from 1942 onward. The Australian rationing system was never as severe or as comprehensive as the British one, but the introduction of even relatively modest rationing in a country that had always considered itself blessed with food abundance produced a psychological adjustment that was out of proportion to the actual material restriction involved. Australians who had grown up with the assumption that food was simply there, that the land produced abundantly and that scarcity was something that happened to other people in other places, found the conceptual shift required by rationing genuinely disorienting. The practical impact was manageable, but the symbolic impact, the acknowledgement that even Australia was not insulated from the war's reach into the most basic dimensions of daily life, was something that the Australian civilian population absorbed with a quiet, particular soberness that contemporaries noticed, and that post-war accounts consistently returned to. The ration book was in the Australian context as much a psychological as a practical document. A small paper confirmation that the world had changed, and that no distance from the fighting had fully kept it at bay. Fact 33. Wartime food advertising underwent a dramatic transformation as manufacturers whose products had been reduced in availability or quality by rationing attempted to maintain brand loyalty and goodwill through a war they could not fully participate in commercially. Advertisements for foods that were now rationed or unavailable shifted from promoting the pleasures of the product to celebrating its absence as a form of patriotic sacrifice. It was a rhetorical maneuver that was simultaneously sincere and self-interested, expressing genuine solidarity with the war effort while ensuring the brand remained visible and emotionally positive in consumers' minds for the post-war period when full supply would eventually return. Cadbury's advertisements during the British rationing years are a particularly well-documented example of this strategy. They acknowledged the reduction in chocolate availability with a tone that combined regret with pride, and explicitly framed the post-war return of full chocolate production as something both the company and its customers were collectively looking forward to, together. The emotional investment these advertisements cultivated in future consumption was a calculated commercial strategy, but it also reflected something genuine about the role that branded foods had come to play in civilian emotional life. The way that specific products had become associated with specific pleasures, memories and comforts that the war had interrupted, and that people genuinely and specifically looked forward to recovering when the time finally came. Fact 34. Spices and condiments, not formally rationed in Britain, but scarce and expensive through supply disruption, disappeared quietly from the wartime kitchen in ways that were felt as a specific and cumulatively significant form of culinary loss. Pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, vanilla, and a range of other spices that had been ordinary features of pre-war cooking became luxuries that many households went without for months or years at a time. The effect on the flavor of the wartime diet was significant. Food already constrained by the limitations of rationed ingredients became further constrained by the absence of the seasoning that had given it variety and interest. Some cooks developed considerable ingenuity in substituting available flavoring agents, using dried herbs grown in garden pots, experimenting with combinations of whatever aromatics were still at hand. But the absence of imported spices from the wartime kitchen was a genuine and persistent impoverishment of the daily eating experience. The return of spices to the British kitchen after the war is described in some post-war accounts with a pleasure and a relief that speaks to how completely their absence had been felt, and how thoroughly the flavor of wartime cooking had been reduced by it. A pinch of nutmeg in a bechamel sauce, a proper vanilla extract in a cake, small things, in the context of everything, but genuinely, specifically missed in ways that mattered more than they might appear to. Fact 35. Wartime rationing fundamentally changed the role of the butcher in British community life, transforming the relationship between butcher and customer from a simple commercial transaction into something considerably more personal and considerably more fraught. Butchers found themselves in possession of a scarce and emotionally loaded resource that their customers needed, wanted, and had strong feelings about. The management of this scarcity required decisions that affected individual families directly and significantly, and the social pressure attached to those decisions was considerable. Regular customers expected preferential treatment as a reward for loyalty. New customers hoped for basic fair dealing. Everyone quietly suspected that the butcher had better cuts in the back reserved for favored clients. The reality was that most butchers tried to manage their allocation as fairly as commercial interest and human nature allowed. But the conditions of scarcity inevitably created the perception, and sometimes the reality, of favoritism. The relationship that developed between wartime households and their local butcher was therefore one of the most emotionally textured commercial relationships in the civilian wartime experience. A daily negotiation between need, loyalty, fairness, and scarcity, played out across a counter, by two parties navigating it with varying degrees of skill, grace, and mutual goodwill. It was in its way one of the most human arrangements the war produced. Fact 36. The wartime experience of food rationing in occupied France was shaped by a system deliberately designed by the German occupation authorities to extract maximum food resources from French agricultural production for the benefit of Germany, while providing French civilians with allocations technically sufficient for survival, but in practice often inadequate. French farmers were required to deliver quotas of produce to German collection points, with penalties for failing to meet them severe enough to ensure compliance in most cases. The French civilian ration varied significantly by category. Heavy manual workers received more than office workers, who received more than non-working adults, in a system whose complexity was itself a form of administrative control. The gap between the official ration and what was actually available in shops was a persistent feature of daily life, as supply disruptions, black market diversion, and administrative inefficiency meant that the theoretical allocation was frequently unavailable in practice. French civilians responded with the resourcefulness and creativity that long culinary traditions of making the most of available ingredients can produce. But they responded also with a quiet, steady resentment that the occupation had fed, quite literally, by the daily experience of watching the food their country produced disappear eastward while their own tables grew progressively more bare. Food in occupied France was absence made visible every single day. Fact 37. Preserving food at home, bottling fruit, making jam, pickling vegetables, curing meat, became a patriotic activity during the war years in Britain and America, encouraged by government campaigns that framed domestic preservation as a direct and personal contribution to the national food supply. The Women's Institute in Britain organized preserving centers where local fruit and vegetables could be processed in bulk and stored for community use, producing millions of jars of jam and bottled fruit that supplemented the official ration through the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. In the United States, the government's Food for Freedom campaign encouraged home canning with a similar combination of practical instruction and patriotic framing. Americans canning their garden produce were told they were contributing to the war effort as surely as the men in uniform. The revival of home preservation skills that the war produced was significant and lasting. Many women who learned to bottle fruit and make jam during the war years continued doing so long after rationing ended, incorporating the skill into a domestic routine from which it had largely disappeared in the preceding decades of cheap and reliable commercial supply. The war, in this sense, produced a genuine transfer of practical food knowledge back into the domestic sphere, with implications for household practice, community organization, and the relationship between families and their food that extended well beyond the rationing years themselves. Fact 38. Wartime rationing revealed with uncomfortable clarity the extent to which the pre-war British diet had been dependent on imported food, a dependency that had developed over the preceding century as cheap global food imports had made domestic production increasingly uncompetitive. Before the war, Britain imported approximately 55% of its food. The German U-boat campaign was specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability. The systematic targeting of Atlantic supply convoys was, in its strategic logic, an attempt to starve Britain into submission, and its success in sinking shipping during the worst periods of the Battle of the Atlantic brought the country closer to a genuine food crisis than the government was willing to publicly acknowledge at the time. The dramatic expansion of domestic food production that followed, driven by the Ploughing Up campaign and the Dig for Victory initiative, was a direct response to this exposed vulnerability. By 1943, domestic food production had increased to a level that had significantly reduced import dependency, a transformation that the pre-war agricultural establishment would have considered essentially impossible. It had been achieved at considerable cost in labor, land, and the near-total reorganization of an entire industry under wartime emergency conditions. It was in its quiet way one of the most remarkable industrial and social transformations of the entire war, visible not in any single dramatic moment but in the slow greening of fields across a country that had decided it could not afford to depend on anyone else to feed it. Fact 39. The emotional experience of shopping for food under rationing was shaped by a constant background awareness of the gap between what a family wanted and what they were permitted to have, a gap that was managed differently by different households but universally present and universally felt. Wartime shopping required a form of advanced planning and careful allocation that the relative abundance of pre-war food shopping had never demanded. The mental load of this planning fell almost exclusively on the women managing household food budgets. The weekly ritual of deciding how to allocate the ration, which meals to plan, which treats to prioritize, how to distribute limited meat or butter or sugar across 7 days in a way that produced the maximum satisfaction from the minimum, was a genuine exercise in domestic management requiring real skill and producing real stress when the calculations did not quite work out. Women who were good at this were recognized within their households as exercising a genuine expertise, even if that recognition rarely extended beyond the domestic sphere. Those who found it difficult, who ran out of key items before the week was over, or who could not produce meals that felt adequate on the available supplies, experienced a specific form of domestic failure that the culture of the time made particularly difficult to carry without self-criticism. It was a particular kind of pressure, felt in a particular kind of silence, that the history of the war does not always remember clearly enough. Fact 40. When rationing finally ended in Britain, with the derationing of meat and bacon on the 4th of July, 1954, almost 9 years after the war itself had ended, the response of the British public was a mixture of genuine relief, quiet celebration, and for many people, a complicated emotional ambivalence that surprised even those who were feeling it. 9 years of rationing had done more than restrict what people could eat. It had shaped how they thought about food, how they related to scarcity and abundance, how they understood the connection between individual consumption and collective well-being. The end of rationing meant freedom, the freedom to buy what you wanted in the quantities you wanted, without consulting a book of coupons or calculating a weekly allocation. But it also meant the end of a system that had, whatever its frustrations, provided a form of equality in daily life that many people found, in retrospect, to have had a social value they had not fully appreciated while living inside it. The return of unlimited purchasing power meant the return of social inequalities that rationing had at least partially suspended. The wealthy could once again eat better than the poor in ways the ration book had constrained. Some people who celebrated the end of rationing also mourned, quietly, something that the long, austere years had produced in them and in their communities, something the return of abundance was already, almost immediately, beginning to dissolve. Fact 41. Nobody who lived through the wartime rationing years ever quite forgot the specific weight of a ration book in their hands. It was a small document, modest in size, printed on ordinary paper, bureaucratic in its layout, but it carried an emotional gravity that far exceeded its physical dimensions. The ration book was simultaneously a permission slip, a budget, a social contract, and a weekly reminder of everything that had been taken away. Losing one was a domestic catastrophe of the first order. The process of reporting a lost ration book to the local food office, queuing to have it replaced, and managing without it in the interim was an ordeal that wartime diarists describe with a vividness that speaks to how completely the book had become the organizational center of domestic food life. Children were given strict and repeated instructions about never touching the ration book. Households developed specific, inviolable routines about where it was kept. Women who managed their households' ration books describe, in post-war interviews, a relationship with these documents that had qualities of vigilance and protectiveness more commonly associated with passports or birth certificates than with a food allocation ledger. The ration book was, in the most literal and practical sense, the document that stood between a family and hunger, and it was treated accordingly, every single day. Fact 42. Certain foods that had been entirely ordinary features of pre-war life vanished so completely from civilian availability during the rationing years that their eventual return felt like the recovery of something genuinely lost rather than merely postponed. Bananas disappeared from British shops almost entirely for the duration of the war. Imports from the Caribbean and West Africa ceased when the shipping carrying them was diverted to military use, and the fruit simply ceased to exist as a feature of ordinary British life for approximately 6 years. Children who had been born just before or during the war reached the ages of 5, 6, or 7 having never seen a real banana. The stories their older siblings and parents told them about the fruit carried the quality of descriptions of something exotic and almost mythological. When bananas returned to British shops in 1946, the event was significant enough to be reported in national newspapers. The response of children encountering the fruit for the first time was documented with a charmed attention that speaks to how thoroughly their absence had been felt. Some children given a banana for the first time attempted to eat it without peeling it, having received descriptions of the fruit but no direct experience of how it was actually consumed. It was a small and somewhat comic moment, but it contained within it the full strangeness of a childhood shaped by a world that had been comprehensively rearranged around the demands of war, leaving gaps in daily life that only revealed their full size when the things that had filled them quietly returned. Fact 43. Margarine replaced butter in millions of British households during the rationing years, and the adjustment required went well beyond the practical matter of using a different fat in cooking. Butter had been for most British households before the war simply the thing you put on bread. Unremarkable, reliable, deeply familiar, carrying in its flavor and texture a set of sensory associations that had accumulated over a lifetime of daily use. The switch to margarine was not experienced as a neutral substitution. It was a specific and recurring reminder of what had been lost, a daily edible version of the general wartime experience of making do with something that was almost but not quite the thing it was supposed to replace. Wartime margarine was by most contemporary accounts significantly inferior in both flavor and texture to the butter it replaced. The government's efforts to improve its quality and palatability were only partially successful. Manufacturers worked throughout the war to develop margarine formulations that more closely approximated the experience of butter, with results that improved incrementally but never entirely closed the gap. The persistence of margarine as a household staple in Britain long after the war ended, driven partly by price and partly by habits formed during the rationing years, meant that the substitution that had begun as a wartime necessity gradually became for many households simply the new normal. A permanent legacy of a temporary emergency, settled quietly into daily life, one breakfast at a time. Fact 44. Soup kitchens and communal feeding centers established during the Blitz evolved, over the course of the war, into a network of publicly funded eating facilities that represented one of the most significant expansions of state-provided food services in British history. The British Restaurants Programme, initially conceived as emergency feeding for bombing victims, grew into a network of over 2,000 establishments serving simple, hot, nutritious meals at fixed low prices to anyone who wanted them. They were deliberately unbranded, unglamorous, and accessible. The design philosophy was inclusivity rather than comfort, and the meals were nutritionally adequate rather than culinarily ambitious. But within their limitations, they performed a social function that went beyond simple food provision. They were one of the few spaces in wartime Britain where people from genuinely different social backgrounds regularly sat down and ate the same meal together. The democratic texture of this experience, the shared table, the standard menu, the absence of the price differentials that ordinarily separated dining experiences by class, was something that regular users described with an appreciation suggesting it met a social need as well as a nutritional one. The British restaurants were, in their quiet and practical way, a small daily experiment in the kind of equality that the rhetoric of wartime national unity promised, and that the actual structures of British society only occasionally and imperfectly delivered. Fact 45. Rabbits became an unlikely symbol of wartime civilian resourcefulness across both Britain and occupied Europe, moving from the status of a minor and somewhat looked down upon protein source to a central and genuinely valued component of the wartime diet. In Britain, backyard rabbit keeping expanded dramatically during the rationing years, encouraged by government campaigns framing rabbit production as a practical and patriotic contribution to household food supply. Unlike chickens, which competed with humans for grain supplies, rabbits could be fed largely on kitchen scraps, grass, and garden waste, making them an unusually efficient converter of available resources into usable protein. Families who kept rabbits faced, inevitably, the emotional difficulty of killing and eating animals that children had sometimes named and treated as pets. This was managed differently in different households, with strategies ranging from strict rules against naming the animals to the practical delegation of slaughter to the least emotionally invested family member. The rabbit problem, as it was sometimes called in wartime correspondence, was a small but revealing instance of the way the war forced ordinary families to navigate, on a practical and daily basis, the distance between the food on their plate and the living creature it had recently been. It was not a comfortable distance, but it was one that millions of families crossed quietly and without ceremony because the children needed to be fed. Fact 46. Price controls, introduced alongside rationing in most wartime economies, created a regulated food market designed to prevent profiteering, but they also produced their own complex set of unintended consequences in the civilian food experience. By fixing the maximum prices at which rationed and non-rationed foods could be sold, governments attempted to ensure that scarcity did not translate directly into unaffordability for lower-income households. The experience of the First World War, in which food prices had spiraled far beyond the reach of working-class families, had made this politically urgent. In Britain, the combination of rationing and price controls did succeed in maintaining the affordability of basic foods for most of the population throughout the war, a genuine improvement on the First World War experience, recognized as such by those who remembered both. But price controls also created distortions. When official prices were set below the level at which production was economically viable for certain products, supply contracted. Farmers reduced production of items not worth producing at the controlled price. The result was shortages that the rationing system alone had not caused, but that the interaction between rationing and price control had together produced. Managing these dynamics required continuous government intervention and adjustment throughout the war. A system of escalating complexity that civilian administrators sometimes described, with a certain rueful honesty, as barely staying ahead of its own contradictions. Fact 47. Victory Gardens in the United States produced, at their peak in 1943 and 1944, an estimated 8 to 10 million tons of vegetables annually, a quantity equivalent to approximately 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the country that year. This figure is remarkable not only in its scale but in what it reveals about the capacity of ordinary civilian effort, organized and directed by government encouragement, to make a genuine material contribution to national food supply. The American Victory Garden movement was, in quantitative terms, one of the most successful civilian mobilization campaigns in the history of any wartime democracy. Gardens appeared on rooftops, in vacant lots, in public parks, and in the backyards of suburban houses whose owners had never previously grown anything more demanding than ornamental flowers. Community garden projects in urban areas created collective growing spaces where neighbors worked side by side on shared plots, developing in the process the kind of practical social cooperation that the more individualistic culture of American suburban life did not ordinarily produce or require. The Victory Garden was therefore not only a food production initiative, it was also, incidentally and by no means accidentally, a community-building exercise that brought neighbors into a working relationship with each other, and with the land beneath their feet, in ways that the ordinary routines of American suburban life had never needed, and never thought to ask for. Fact 48. Foraging. The collection of wild foods from hedgerows, fields and woodlands experienced a significant revival during the war years across Britain and occupied Europe, as civilians supplemented their rationed diets with whatever the natural environment could provide. In Britain, the Ministry of Food actively promoted the collection of wild foods, publishing guides to edible plants and organizing community foraging expeditions in rural areas. Blackberries, elderberries, crab apples, rose hips, watercress, nettles, and mushrooms all featured in government-endorsed guides, presented with recipes and preservation instructions that treated wild food collection as a practical contribution to civilian food supply rather than a desperate last resort. Rose hip syrup, produced from the hips of wild rose plants and rich in vitamin C, became a significant component of the wartime children's supplementary nutrition program after imports of citrus fruit were cut off. An overlooked hedgerow fruit was transformed, almost overnight, into a nationally important nutritional resource. The revival of foraging knowledge during the war years had lasting effects on the relationship between certain communities and their local natural environment. People who had learned during the war years to read the hedgerow as a food source retained that knowledge and in some cases passed it on, creating a thread of practical botanical understanding that connected the wartime emergency to the much later revival of interest in wild food that emerged in the 21st century, as if the two eras were quietly reaching across time toward the same living hedge. Fact 49. School meals underwent a dramatic expansion during the war years in Britain that permanently altered the relationship between the state, the school, and the nutritional well-being of children. Before the war, school meals provision in Britain was limited and inconsistent, available in some areas, absent in others, and generally associated with poverty and charitable provision rather than universal entitlement. The wartime expansion was driven partly by the practical reality that many mothers were now working in factories and war industries and were not available to prepare a midday meal, and partly by a growing recognition that the nutritional standards of working-class children were inadequate in ways the war had made both more visible and more politically urgent. By 1945, school meal provision had expanded to cover approximately 1/3 of all British schoolchildren, a dramatic increase from the pre-war level, and the quality and nutritional content of those meals was subject to government oversight in ways that pre-war provision had never been. The expansion of school meals during the war years laid the practical and political groundwork for the post-war universal provision that became a feature of the welfare state. It was one of the many ways in which the wartime emergency created social infrastructure whose effects extended far beyond the emergency conditions that had originally called it into being, quietly shaping the world that would come after, while the world it was living in had not yet found its way to peace. Fact 50. Italy's experience of food rationing under the fascist government, and then under the conditions of Allied invasion and occupation, represented one of the most chaotic and least coherently managed civilian food situations of the entire war. The Italian rationing system, introduced in 1939, was from the beginning undermined by the combination of an inefficient agricultural economy, a corrupt administrative apparatus, and a government whose ideological commitment to projecting national strength made honest public communication about food scarcity politically unacceptable. Italian civilians received official ration allocations that were on paper more generous than the British system, but frequently unavailable in practice because the supply chains required to deliver them had broken down or been diverted. The collapse of the fascist government in 1943 and the subsequent Allied invasion created a food situation that deteriorated from inadequate to catastrophic in many areas. Allied military governments attempting to manage civilian food supply in liberated areas found themselves dealing with a population that was in many cases close to genuine starvation, in a country whose agricultural infrastructure had been severely damaged by years of mismanagement followed by months of active military destruction. The Italian civilian food experience was in its disorganization and its human cost, a case study in what happens when the state apparatus responsible for managing wartime food supply proves unequal to the task it has been given. Fact 51. Making a birthday cake during the war years was an act of such quiet domestic heroism that it deserves its own careful and appreciative attention. The ingredients required for a proper cake, butter, sugar, eggs, white flour, were precisely the ingredients that rationing had made scarce, expensive, or unavailable. The production of a celebratory cake for a child's birthday required weeks of advanced planning, careful saving, and genuine culinary ingenuity. Families saved their butter and sugar allocations over multiple weeks to accumulate enough for a single cake. Dried egg was used in place of fresh. Plain wholemeal flour substituted for the white flour that gave a proper sponge its light, airy texture. The resulting cake was often denser, less sweet, and less impressive in appearance than its pre-war equivalent, but the effort that had gone into it gave it a significance that the most elaborate peacetime confection could not match. Children who received a wartime birthday cake understood, even if they could not fully articulate it, that something considerable had been given to them. That the cake represented not merely a pleasant food but a concentrated expression of love and domestic effort that the scarcity of the time had made into something genuinely precious. Some of these children, grown into adults and then into the elderly, described the wartime birthday cakes of their childhood as among the most meaningful food experiences of their entire lives, not because the cake was good, but because of everything that had gone into making it possible. Fact 52. Throughout occupied Europe, The garden, whether a backyard plot, a balcony container, or a strip of ground beside a rented room, became one of the primary sites of civilian agency in a world where most other forms of agency had been removed. Growing food was one of the very few things occupied civilians could do that was entirely within their own control, that produced a direct and tangible result, and that maintained a connection to the natural rhythms of growth and season that the war's disruption of ordinary life had otherwise severed. In the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Poland, urban vegetable growing expanded dramatically during the occupation years. Balconies that had held flower boxes were replanted with tomatoes and herbs. Ornamental gardens were dug over for potatoes and beans. Parks and public spaces were converted, informally or with quiet official encouragement, to food production. The garden in this context was a form of quiet resistance as much as a practical food source, an assertion of the civilians' continued capacity to act purposefully in their own interests, to produce rather than only consume, to maintain a relationship with living growth that the greyness and destruction of occupation could not entirely eliminate. It was a small defiance, but it was real, and for many people in the long years when very little else was within their reach, it was genuinely sustaining. Fact 53. Chocolate manufacturers in the United States used the wartime rationing period to undertake a fundamental reformulation of their products that had lasting consequences for the American confectionery industry long after the war ended. Hershey's, working under contract with the United States Army, developed a heat-resistant, high-calorie chocolate bar specifically designed for military field rations. It was deliberately made less palatable than ordinary chocolate on the grounds that soldiers should not eat their emergency rations simply for pleasure. The result was a bar that soldiers described with considerable expressiveness as tasting like a boiled potato, a characterization that was not entirely inaccurate given the deliberate modification of the formula. But the wartime relationship between chocolate manufacturers and the military had broader consequences than the production of unpalatable emergency rations. It established patterns of industrial-scale chocolate production, ingredient substitution, and formula optimization that continued to shape the American confectionery industry in the post-war decades. The result was the distinctive flavor profile of American mass-market chocolate, which differs noticeably from European equivalents, and which has its roots, at least partly, in the reformulations and production methods developed under the specific constraints of wartime manufacturing. A taste shaped by necessity, preserved long after the necessity had passed, and now simply part of how American chocolate tastes, carrying within it, without anyone quite knowing, a flavor memory of the war. Fact 54. Greek civilians endured some of the most severe food conditions of the entire war during the Axis occupation, in circumstances that revealed with terrible clarity what happened when an agricultural country's food supply was systematically stripped for the benefit of occupying forces. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria, divided Greece into occupation zones in 1941 and immediately began requisitioning food supplies for their own military and civilian needs, removing from circulation the agricultural production on which the Greek civilian population depended. The result was a famine of catastrophic proportions. In Athens, bodies of civilians who had died of starvation were collected from streets and apartments daily during the winter of 1941 to 1942. Estimates of the total death toll from the famine across Greece range from 100,000 to 300,000 people. The Greek famine of 1941 to 1942 stands as one of the clearest examples in the entire war of food being used, through deliberate policy rather than simple neglect, as an instrument of civilian destruction. Fact 55. Bread queues in occupied Paris became one of the most visible and most emotionally charged features of daily civilian life during the German occupation, a daily public theater of scarcity and endurance that spoke more honestly than any official announcement about what occupation actually meant for ordinary Parisians. The French bread ration under the occupation was set at levels that decreased progressively as the war continued, and Germany's demands on the queue for this bread began forming in the pre-dawn hours, because the available supply was insufficient to serve all who came later in the day. The women who stood in those queues for hours in cold and darkness were performing a form of domestic labor whose demands were both physical and psychological. They were cold, they were hungry, they were waiting for bread that was inadequate, and they did it every day, because the alternative was that their families did not eat. The bread queue was in this sense one of the truest and most unsparing representations of what occupation cost the people who lived inside it. Not the large history of armies and politics, but the daily, unglamorous, exhausting truth of simply trying to feed the people you loved. Fact 56. Nutritional science made some of its most significant practical advances during the Second World War, driven by the urgent need to understand and manage the health consequences of rationing across large civilian populations. The work of scientists Elsie Widdowson and Robert McCants in Britain, who produced a comprehensive analysis of the nutritional composition of British foods in their 1940 publication, that became an essential tool for wartime food policy, represented a direct application of scientific research to the practical management of civilian health under conditions of enforced dietary restriction. Their work demonstrated that the British wartime diet, while limited in variety and reduced in certain luxuries, was nutritionally adequate if properly managed, a finding that was both practically important and politically significant, providing the government with the scientific basis for its claim that rationing was compatible with civilian health. The wartime investment in nutritional science had lasting effects on the field, establishing methodologies and creating datasets that continue to inform nutritional research for decades after the war. The scientists who worked on wartime food problems found that the emergency had provided them with a natural experiment of a kind that could not have been ethically arranged under normal circumstances, a large population eating a simplified and carefully documented diet for an extended period. The knowledge generated from this unintended experiment was genuinely and lastingly valuable, one of the quieter legacies of a time that was not quiet in any other respect. Fact 57. Rationing created a new set of criminal opportunities that law enforcement agencies in Britain, the United States, and other rationing countries found themselves wholly unprepared to manage. Forged ration books, stolen allocations, fraudulent registration of fictitious household members, and the illegal diversion of rationed goods through commercial channels all represented new categories of crime that had not existed before the rationing system created them. The scale of ration fraud in Britain was significant enough to require a dedicated enforcement apparatus. Inspectors employed by the Ministry of Food who investigated suspected fraud, prosecuted offenders, and worked to maintain the integrity of the system against the constant pressure of those attempting to circumvent it. The moral dimension of ration fraud was taken seriously by the government's public communications, which framed it explicitly as a form of theft from fellow civilians. Taking more than your fair share in a system designed around equal distribution was presented not as a crime against the government, but as a betrayal of your neighbors. This framing was broadly effective in establishing a social norm against conspicuous ration fraud, but it did not eliminate the phenomenon. Need, opportunism, and the availability of a profitable market for diverted goods ensured that fraud persisted throughout the rationing period at a level that enforcement could reduce but never entirely suppress. The system had been designed for honesty. The world it operated in was, as always, considerably more complicated than that. Fact 58. Cookery programs on BBC Radio during the war years attracted audiences that would have been considered extraordinary for cooking content in any other context, because the information they provided was not entertainment but practical necessity for millions of households managing rationed ingredients. The Kitchen Front, broadcast on BBC Radio at 8:15 every morning immediately after the news, reached an estimated 5 million listeners daily. That figure speaks to the urgency with which wartime housewives sought practical guidance on the daily challenge of producing meals from the available supplies. The program featured contributions from a range of food writers, nutritionists, and celebrity cooks, including figures like Ambrose Heath and Mabel Constandaros, who developed significant personal followings through their wartime broadcasts. What distinguished the best of these broadcasts was their tone, a combination of practical authority and genuine empathy with the difficulties their listeners were facing. The presenters did not pretend that wartime cooking was easy or that the results were as satisfying as pre-war equivalents. They acknowledged the difficulty honestly while providing the most useful guidance they could. This combination of honesty and practical support created a relationship with their audience that went beyond the transactional and produced something closer to genuine companionship, a shared acknowledgement of a challenge that nobody had chosen and nobody was entirely sure how to navigate, met daily by a warm, practical voice that knew exactly what you were dealing with and was there to help. Fact 59. Potatoes became the single most important food in the British wartime diet, a status the government actively promoted through one of its most memorable and most sustained communication campaigns of the entire rationing period. Potato Pete, a cartoon character created by the Ministry of Food to encourage potato consumption, appeared on posters, in recipe booklets, and in newspaper advertisements urging British civilians to eat potatoes at every meal as a substitute for the rationed and imported foods that had become unavailable. The campaign's underlying logic was sound. Potatoes were domestically grown, available in quantity, nutritionally valuable, versatile in cooking, and filling in a way that mattered for a population whose overall caloric intake had been reduced. But the promotion of potatoes as a primary food rather than a side dish required a cultural shift in a country where they had always been a supporting player rather than the main event. The Ministry of Food's recipe literature from this period contains an extensive and sometimes heroic collection of potato-based dishes: potato pastry, potato bread, potato soup, potato scones, mashed potato incorporated into cakes, representing one of the most thorough explorations of a single ingredient's culinary versatility ever produced under official direction. Whether all these preparations were genuinely pleasurable to eat is a question that contemporary accounts answer with varying degrees of diplomatic restraint. Fact 60. When the Second World War ended and the immediate pressures of rationing gradually eased over the following years, the generation that had lived through the full experience of wartime food restriction emerged with a relationship to food that was permanently and distinctively marked by what they had endured. The habits formed during the rationing years, the careful use of leftovers, the reluctance to waste food, the instinctive planning of meals around what was available rather than what was desired, the particular appreciation for foods that had once been scarce, were not simply wartime coping strategies. They had become, through years of daily practice, genuine features of character that the return of post-war abundance did not simply dissolve. Many people from this generation found themselves, in the prosperity of the 1950s and beyond, uncomfortable with the waste that abundance made possible, unable to throw away food that was still edible, unable to leave a plate unfinished, unable to approach a well-stocked shop without some residual awareness of a time when the shelves had been bare. This discomfort was not a pathology. It was a form of memory, embodied, practical and persistent, of an experience that had taught its survivors something real and lasting about the relationship between scarcity, gratitude, and the value of the ordinary daily act of simply eating enough. That knowledge did not fade with the years, it stayed. Fact 61. Salt, one of the most ancient and fundamental of all food preservation tools, took on a renewed practical importance during the wartime rationing years as civilian cooks across Britain and occupied Europe returned to home preservation methods that commercial food processing had largely displaced in the preceding decades. The scarcity of tinned and commercially preserved foods, either because the tin plate required for their manufacture had been redirected to military use, or because the supply chains delivering them had been disrupted, pushed households back toward older preservation technologies that relied on salt, vinegar, sugar, and smoke rather than industrial canning. Families who had never previously cured their own meat or pickled their own vegetables found themselves learning these techniques from older relatives or from government publications that presented traditional preservation methods as modern patriotic practice. The revival of salt curing in particular gave many families their first direct experience of the connection between the preservation of food and the passage of time. The understanding that a properly salted piece of pork would keep for weeks in conditions where an unsalted one would not last days. This reconnection with the physical chemistry of food preservation was one of the more unexpected educational outcomes of the rationing period, producing in a generation of civilian cooks a practical understanding of food science that commercial convenience had previously made entirely unnecessary, and that many of them carried with genuine pride for the rest of their lives. Fact 62. Menus in British restaurants during the war years were subject to restrictions that fundamentally altered the dining experience in ways that affected not only what people ate, but how eating out felt as a social activity. The 3-course limit on restaurant meals, combined with the price cap of 5 shillings per meal, compressed the restaurant experience into a form that was notably more democratic and notably less luxurious than the pre-war equivalents. Restaurants that had previously offered elaborate multi-course menus with extensive wine lists found themselves working within constraints that forced a simplicity of offering that some establishments managed with grace and others with visible reluctance. The social function of restaurant dining, as a marker of status, a display of taste and means, a pleasurable departure from domestic eating, was significantly modified by these constraints, producing something that was still recognizably a restaurant meal, but that carried less of the social weight and theatrical elaboration that pre-war dining had provided. For customers who had previously been unable to afford restaurant dining at all, the price cap made the experience accessible for the first time, a democratizing effect that was partly offset by the continued existence of private clubs and other establishments operating outside the ordinary regulatory framework, continuing to offer a quality of food and service that remained unavailable to anyone without the right social connections. Wartime had leveled some things. It had not leveled everything. Fact 63. Wartime rationing in Canada operated within the specific context of a country that was both a major food producer and a significant supplier to allied nations, creating a civilian rationing experience shaped by the tension between domestic sufficiency and the moral imperative of solidarity with less fortunate allies. Canada introduced rationing of sugar, butter, meat, and preserves during the war years, but the restrictions were considerably less severe than those experienced in Britain, reflecting the genuine material abundance of a country whose agricultural production was not constrained by occupation or disrupted supply chains. The relative mildness of Canadian rationing created a particular kind of moral discomfort among civilians who were aware of the far more severe conditions being endured in Britain and occupied Europe, an awareness actively promoted by government communications that framed Canadian rationing not as a response to genuine scarcity but as an act of solidarity with allies who were suffering far more acutely. This framing gave Canadian rationing a different emotional texture from the British experience. It was less about managing genuine want and more about the voluntary acceptance of constraint as an expression of shared purpose. The willingness of Canadian civilians to accept rationing under these circumstances, to limit their own comfortable consumption in solidarity with the genuine suffering of others, was itself a meaningful and moral act, and one that the government's communications were careful to acknowledge and reinforce, understanding that solidarity freely chosen carries a weight and a dignity that compulsion never quite manages to produce. Fact 64. Baking bread at home experienced a significant revival during the war years in Britain, driven partly by the inferior quality of the national loaf and partly by the general wartime impulse towards self-sufficiency and domestic food production. Women who had previously purchased bread from bakeries began baking their own, producing loaves that were sometimes better and sometimes considerably worse than the commercial product they replaced, but that carried in their production an element of control and agency that the wartime context made particularly valuable. Home bread baking required skills that many urban women had never needed to develop before the war. The management of yeast, the assessment of dough consistency, the judgment of oven temperature in an era when thermostats were not universal. The learning process produced both genuine failures and genuine satisfactions in quantities that varied by household and by baker. The smell of bread baking became for many families one of the most powerfully positive sensory experiences of the entire wartime period. A scent that was simultaneously nourishing, familiar, and deeply reassuring in a context where much of the sensory environment of daily life had been made strange and threatening. Several wartime diarists describe the smell of their own baking bread with an emotional intensity that suggests it functioned as a sensory anchor, a connection to normalcy and domestic warmth in the midst of a world that had become, in almost every other respect, profoundly and persistently abnormal. Fact 65. Rationing's effect on the Japanese civilian diet followed a trajectory that moved from genuine austerity in the early war years to conditions of near-total collapse in the final months of the conflict. Japan's island geography made its food supply inherently vulnerable to naval disruption, and as American submarines and aircraft systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping from 1943 onward, the flow of food imports into the home islands slowed and eventually nearly ceased. The rice ration. Rice being the absolute dietary foundation of Japanese civilian life in a way that had no real equivalent in Western food cultures, was progressively reduced as the war continued, supplemented and eventually largely replaced by substitute foods including sweet potatoes, soybeans, acorns, and a range of other items that had not previously been considered significant food sources. By 1945, the caloric intake of the average Japanese urban civilian had fallen to levels causing widespread malnutrition. Government programs to prepare civilians to grow food in any available urban space, parks, roadsides, the grounds of schools and temples, were being pursued with an urgency that reflected the genuine desperation of the situation. The collapse of the Japanese civilian food supply in the war's final year was one of the primary factors shaping the experience of the civilian population during the period of maximum Allied bombing, adding the steady, grinding pressure of hunger to the terror of firestorms raining from the sky. Fact 66. Olia margarine, the American equivalent of British wartime margarine, arrived in American households during the rationing years in a form that was legally required to be sold without its characteristic yellow coloring. Powerful dairy industry lobbying had ensured that laws in many American states prohibited the sale of artificially colored margarine that might be mistaken for butter. The result was that American households purchasing margarine received a product that was white or pale gray in color, visually unappealing and immediately distinguishable from the butter it was replacing. Manufacturers responded by including small capsules of yellow food coloring with each package, allowing households to knead the color into the margarine themselves before use. This process became, in many American homes, a regular domestic task typically assigned to children, who could be relied upon to work the color through the fat with sufficient thoroughness. The yellow capsule and the kneading ritual became a minor but distinctive feature of American wartime domestic life. A small, slightly absurd, entirely characteristic example of the way the wartime emergency and the commercial and political interests surrounding it combined to produce domestic practices that were simultaneously practical, bizarre, and oddly memorable. Adults who had been children during the war years consistently remembered the margarine kneading with a vividness that speaks to the particular way that recurring physical tasks embed themselves in childhood memory and stay there warm and specific for the rest of a life. Fact 67. Wartime food rationing produced a generation of British women who understood nutrition with a practical depth and precision that had no real pre-war equivalent. The necessity of extracting maximum nutritional value from minimum ingredients, of ensuring that a family was adequately nourished on an allocation that left no room for waste or ignorance, drove a genuine popular engagement with the science of nutrition that the Ministry of Food actively encouraged through its publications, broadcasts, and demonstration programs. Women who before the war had cooked from habit and tradition, reproducing familiar dishes without much analytical attention to their nutritional content, found themselves during the rationing years consulting calorie tables, studying protein content, and thinking carefully about the specific nutritional requirements of children, pregnant women, and working adults. This enforced nutritional literacy had lasting effects on the domestic food practices of the wartime generation, a heightened attention to what food actually contained and what it actually did for the body, that persisted long after the necessity of managing a ration book had passed. Some nutritionists working in the post-war period identified the wartime generation of British housewives as the most nutritionally informed population cohort in British history up to that point. It was a distinction they had earned not through education or particular interest, but through the daily practical demands of keeping a family healthy on a ration, knowledge born entirely of necessity, and carried with quiet dignity for the rest of their lives. Fact 68. Church halls, scout huts, and village institutes across rural Britain became centres of communal food processing during the harvest seasons of the war years, as the Women's Institute and similar organisations arranged collective jam-making, bottling, and preserving sessions that turned local fruit and vegetable harvests into stored food for the community's winter use. These communal sessions, in which women brought their own produce and equipment to a shared space and worked together through the labor-intensive processes of washing, preparing, cooking, and sealing, represented a form of cooperative domestic labor that had largely disappeared from British rural life before the war, as commercial food processing had made it unnecessary. The revival of this cooperative model had social effects that went beyond food production. Women who worked together through a long day of jam making developed relationships of practical familiarity and mutual knowledge that the more individualistic domestic routines of peacetime did not generate. They talked while they worked, about their families, their anxieties, their news from the front, their strategies for managing the rationing, and the combination of shared physical labor and sustained conversation produced a form of community that many participants later described as one of the genuinely positive social experiences of an otherwise difficult period. The wartime jam-making sessions were unglamorous, tiring, and sticky, but they were also, in their own modest way, a form of collective life that the war had unexpectedly restored to places that had quietly been missing it. Fact 69. Coffee rationing in the United States affected middle-class American households with a particular sharpness because coffee occupied in the American daily routine a position broadly equivalent to tea in the British one, a habitual, relied upon, emotionally significant daily pleasure whose restriction was felt as a specific and recurring privation rather than a simple dietary adjustment. The American coffee ration, introduced in November 1942, limited each person over 15 to 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks, an allowance representing approximately 1 cup per day if brewed at normal strength or stretched further by brewing it weaker or reusing grounds. Americans adopted strategies for extending their coffee allocation with a creativity that spoke to how seriously they took its management, reusing grounds multiple times, blending real coffee with grain-based substitutes, switching to chicory mixtures, developing strong personal opinions about which compromises in coffee quality were acceptable and which were simply not. Coffee rationing ended in July 1943, after only 8 months, making it one of the shorter-lived of the American rationing measures. But its brief duration did not diminish the intensity with which it was experienced while it lasted. Its end was greeted with a relief genuinely disproportionate to its practical significance, speaking to how deeply the daily cup of coffee had been missed by the population that had been temporarily required to do without it. Some things, it turns out, run deeper than people expect. Fact 70. Wartime food policies in India under British colonial administration created a set of conditions that starkly illustrated the relationship between political power and the distribution of food in ways that the Bengal famine of 1943 made impossible to ignore or explain away as simply the result of natural disaster. The famine, which killed between 2 and 3 million people in Bengal, occurred in a province that had produced a rice surplus in the preceding year. The cause of the starvation was therefore not an absolute shortage of food, but a set of policy decisions that had allowed food prices to rise beyond the reach of the rural poor, while supplies were diverted to military use and to exports. The British wartime government's response to the famine was inadequate in ways that its own internal documents reveal were understood at the time. The decision not to declare a formal famine, which would have triggered specific administrative and relief obligations, was made and maintained for months while people were actively dying of starvation. The Bengal famine stands as one of the most severe indictments of colonial food policy in wartime, a demonstration that the rationing systems designed to protect civilian populations operated, under colonial conditions, in ways explicitly organized around a hierarchy of whose lives the managing power considered worth protecting, and whose it did not. Fact 71. Waste not, want not. The old proverb that had been a background cultural value in British domestic life for generations became during the rationing years something closer to a legally and socially enforced imperative. The government's anti-waste campaigns were among the most persistent and pervasive of all wartime domestic communications, appearing in newspapers, on posters, in radio broadcasts, and through the network of food advisors who visited community groups and workplaces. The campaigns targeted specific forms of food waste: bread left to go stale, vegetable peelings discarded rather than composted or cooked, plate waste in restaurants and canteens, with a specificity and a moral seriousness that reflected genuine government concern about the cumulative impact of civilian food waste on overall supply. In 1940, it became illegal in Britain to feed bread to birds or to use wheat or other cereals to feed pets. Enforcement was difficult, but the existence of the law served an important communicative function, signaling that food waste in any form was now socially and legally unacceptable. The anti-waste culture of the rationing years had lasting effects on the domestic practices of the generation that lived through it. The instinct against throwing away edible food, formed in the specific context of genuine scarcity and genuine moral weight, proved remarkably resistant to erosion even in the decades of post-war abundance that followed. It had become, quietly and permanently, a part of who they were. Fact 72. Wartime rationing transformed the social meaning of giving food as a gift in ways that permanently elevated the emotional weight of food-based presence. Before the war, bringing a box of chocolates or a tin of biscuits when visiting friends or family was a pleasant but essentially unremarkable social gesture, a polite acknowledgement of hospitality rather than a significant offering. Under rationing, the same gift carried an entirely different emotional charge. A box of chocolates given during the rationing years represented a portion of the giver's own allocation, something they had chosen to give away rather than consume themselves. A sacrifice small in absolute terms, but significant in the context of genuine scarcity. Recipients understood this clearly. The emotional response to food gifts during the rationing period reflected a full awareness of what the giving had actually cost. The culture of food gifting that developed during those years, in which the value of a food gift was measured not by its price but by the scarcity from which it had been extracted, persisted in attenuated form in the practices of the wartime generation long after rationing ended. People who had learned during the war years to give food with an awareness of what giving it away truly meant never entirely lost the instinct to attach significance to a gift of something sweet or scarce. Even when sweetness and scarcity had long since ceased to be the same thing, something of that awareness remained, as a kind of permanent tenderness toward the act of giving. Fact 73. Condensed milk, powdered milk, and evaporated milk became significant features of the wartime civilian diet in Britain and in occupied territories across Europe, filling the gap left by reduced supplies of fresh milk with preserved dairy products that were nutritionally adequate but experientially quite different from what they replaced. Condensed milk, sweetened, thick, and intensely flavored, was used in tea by civilians who had run out of or were rationing their sugar allocation, since the sweetness of the condensed milk performed double duty as both dairy and sweetener. Children who grew up during the rationing years developed a taste for condensed milk that persisted long into post-war life, sometimes puzzling younger generations who had grown up with the unrestricted availability of fresh dairy. The specific flavor of wartime condensed milk became, for the generation that consumed it in significant quantities during childhood, a sensory trigger of remarkable reliability, a taste that could, decades later, produce an involuntary and immediate return to the specific emotional texture of the wartime kitchen. The particular combination of scarcity and sweetness and domestic improvisation that those years had produced. Food memories of this kind, intensely specific, involuntary, emotionally freighted, are among the most persistent of all forms of autobiographical memory, and the wartime generation carried theirs into old age with a vividness that time did almost nothing to diminish. The flavor of those years lived on, undimmed, in a spoonful of something sweet. Fact 74. Rationing created an unexpected market for cookery books focused on austerity, frugality, and resourceful cooking, a market that publishers were initially slow to recognize but that quickly became one of the most commercially significant categories in wartime publishing. Books like Ambrose Heath's Wartime Cookery Guides, Doris Grant's work on wholemeal baking, and the various publications produced by the Ministry of Food sold in quantities that reflected genuine demand from a civilian population hungry, in both the practical and the intellectual sense, for guidance on how to cook well under difficult conditions. What distinguished the best of these publications from simple recipe collections was their tone, a combination of practical authority and genuine empathy with the difficulties their readers were facing, producing a reading experience closer to being guided by a knowledgeable friend than being instructed by an official document. The wartime cookery book occupied an unusual position in the domestic literature of the period, simultaneously a practical manual, a morale document, and a quiet companionship for the women managing the daily challenge of feeding their families on what the war had left available. Some of these books remained in print and in active domestic use for decades after the war ended, carried forward by readers who had formed a genuine attachment to their voice and their approach during the years when they had been most needed and most read and most loved in the quiet of the kitchen. Fact 75. Throughout occupied Poland, the relationship between food and survival took on dimensions of moral and physical extremity that went far beyond anything experienced in the Allied rationing countries. The official food ration for Polish civilians under German occupation was set at levels deliberately calculated to be insufficient for long-term survival. Approximately 2,000 calories per day for German civilians, 900 for Poles, between 180 and 220 calories for Jewish Poles confined to ghettos. These were not administrative estimates that failed in practice to reflect actual supply. They were the intentional expression of a policy that assigned different survival values to different categories of human beings, implemented through the food system with a bureaucratic precision that left no room for ambiguity about what was intended. Polish civilians who survived the occupation did so through a combination of illegal food acquisition, informal mutual support networks, and an ingenuity in finding and producing food under conditions of extreme constraint that went well beyond anything that the domestic science of peacetime had prepared them for. The moral and physical dimensions of food survival in occupied Poland were so extreme and so consistently present across the occupation years that food, its acquisition, its preparation, its sharing, and its desperate absence became the central organizing fact of daily civilian existence, in a way that had no equivalent anywhere else in the Allied world, and that those who survived it never entirely left behind. Fact 76. Rationing's end came to different countries at different times and in different forms, and the process of derationing was in many cases almost as disruptive to civilian food habits as the introduction of rationing had originally been. In Britain, the gradual removal of rationing controls between 1948 and 1954 was not experienced as a simple and uniformly joyful restoration of freedom. Each derationing announcement was greeted with genuine relief for the specific item involved. But the adjustments required, the return to market pricing, the reorientation of shopping habits away from the ration book and toward consumer choice, the relearning of purchasing decisions that had been managed by the system for years, were real and took time. Food prices in the immediate post-rationing period were volatile, as supply and demand found new equilibria in markets that had been government-managed for years. The households most constrained by rationing were not always the ones best positioned to benefit from its removal. The end of rationing also brought back the full visibility of social inequality in food consumption. The wealthy could once again eat conspicuously better than the poor in ways that the ration book had partly obscured. The return of this visibility was something that post-war commentators observed, with responses ranging from resigned acceptance to genuine political anger. Freedom had returned, but it was, as it often is, a freedom distributed unequally among the people who had waited for it together. Fact 77. Communal cooking, the sharing of cooking facilities, fuel, and labor between neighboring households, became a practical solution to the double pressure of rationing and fuel shortages in working-class urban communities across Britain during the war years. In terraced streets where houses shared walls and neighbors had known each other for decades, informal arrangements developed in which one household's oven served multiple families, each contributing their ration of fuel or food in exchange for access to the cooking facilities. These arrangements were not formalized or officially encouraged. They emerged organically from the practical needs of the people involved, and from the social infrastructure of communities where mutual dependence had always been a feature of daily life. Their effects were significant. They concentrated the labor of cooking, reduced the fuel consumption of individual households, and produced meals that were, in their pooling of multiple families' rations, somewhat more varied and nutritionally complete than what any single household could have produced alone. But perhaps most importantly, they maintained the social bonds between neighbors under conditions that could otherwise have been atomizing, creating daily occasions for interaction, shared decision-making, and mutual acknowledgement that kept communities connected through years of pressure and loss. The communal cooking arrangements of wartime working-class streets were, in their modest and practical way, one of the most human responses to the inhuman demands that the war had placed on ordinary civilian life. Fact 78. Wartime food rationing in China operated, to the extent that it operated at all, within conditions of such extreme administrative disruption and military chaos that the formal mechanisms of organized food distribution were largely irrelevant to the actual civilian food experience in most affected areas. China had been at war since 1937. The combination of Japanese occupation across large areas of the country, ongoing civil conflict between nationalist and communist forces, the disruption of agricultural production by years of military activity, and the near-total collapse of transport infrastructure in many regions produced a food situation that varied enormously by location, and that was, in the worst affected areas, catastrophic. The Hainan famine of 1942 to 1943, caused by drought, locust infestation, and the requisitioning of grain by both nationalist military forces and Japanese occupation authorities, killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people in a province whose agricultural productivity had been among the most significant in China before the war. The stories of survival from this famine, documented by journalist Theodore White, whose reporting helped bring the catastrophe to international attention, describe conditions of such extreme civilian suffering that the word rationing, with its implication of a managed system of fair distribution, scarcely applies. This was not rationing, it was starvation, administered by the combined failures of nature, military necessity, and institutional indifference to civilian life. Fact 79. Wartime food rationing had lasting effects on the British agricultural industry that extended far beyond the emergency conditions that had originally driven the transformation of farming practice. The dramatic expansion of arable cultivation during the war years, the conversion of millions of acres of grassland to cereal and vegetable production under the Ploughing Up campaign, established patterns of land use and farming practice that the post-war agricultural industry maintained and extended rather than reversed. The intensive, high-yield model of arable farming that the wartime emergency had required was reinforced by post-war agricultural policy, which continued to prioritize food production efficiency and national food security in ways directly shaped by the wartime experience of dangerous import dependency. The subsidies, guaranteed prices, and technical support programs developed during the war to drive agricultural intensification were maintained and expanded in the post-war decades. The environmental consequences of this intensification, the loss of hedgerows, the decline of wildlife habitats, the reduction in agricultural biodiversity, were not anticipated or intended by the wartime planners who had simply been trying to feed a population under siege. But they were real, significant, and directly traceable to decisions made in the context of the wartime food emergency, making the rationing years a pivotal moment in the environmental as well as the social history of British agriculture. Fields that had once held wildflowers and birdsong were changed, and in many cases they did not change back. Fact 80. Perhaps the most quietly revolutionary effect of wartime food rationing was the way it demonstrated, with a practical clarity that no peacetime policy debate had previously achieved, that the state had both the capacity and the legitimate authority to manage the food supply in the interests of the entire population, rather than simply allowing market forces to determine who ate well and who did not. Before the war, the idea of comprehensive government management of civilian food supply would have been politically controversial in both Britain and the United States. It would have been associated with socialism, government overreach, and the infringement of individual economic freedom. The wartime rationing systems demonstrated that such management was not only possible but could be genuinely effective and broadly fair in its outcomes. And this demonstration had lasting political consequences. The post-war expansion of state welfare provision in Britain, including the National Health Service, the expansion of social housing, and the development of universal school meals, drew explicitly on the wartime experience of government food management as evidence that collective provision worked, that the state could be trusted with the management of basic civilian needs. The ration book in this sense was not only a food document, it was also inadvertently and consequentially a political argument, one whose implications extended far beyond the years of scarcity that had made it necessary, and whose quiet force shaped the world that came after. Fact 81. Something that rarely appears in official accounts of wartime rationing but surfaces consistently in personal testimonies is the specific emotional experience of smell, the way that the aromas of certain foods that had become scarce or unavailable could produce, in the people who encountered them unexpectedly, a response that was almost physical in its intensity. The smell of roasting meat drifting from a restaurant kitchen, the scent of freshly ground coffee passing a shop that had somehow obtained a supply, the warm yeasty fragrance of proper white bread baking somewhere nearby. These were experiences that wartime civilians described encountering with a visceral longing that surprised them by its strength. Smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion, and the olfactory associations built up over a lifetime of eating particular foods did not dissolve simply because the foods themselves had become unavailable. Instead, the occasional accidental encounter with a rationed food's aroma served as a sudden and involuntary reminder of everything that had been lost, not only the specific food but the specific life in which that food had been an unremarkable daily presence. Several wartime diarists describe these encounters with a raw honesty that speaks to how completely the rationing years had changed the emotional landscape of ordinary sensory experience, turning the smell of a proper Sunday roast into something that could stop a person in the street with the full, quiet, unexpected force of what they were missing. Fact 82. Wartime rationing in New Zealand followed a pattern broadly similar to the Australian experience, introduced relatively late, applied with a moderation that reflected genuine agricultural abundance, and experienced by a civilian population whose primary relationship to the war's food consequences was one of voluntary solidarity rather than genuine necessity. New Zealand introduced rationing of butter, meat and sugar during the war years, and the system functioned with reasonable administrative competence that reflected the country's small size and relatively uncomplicated food supply chains. What distinguished the New Zealand rationing experience from the British equivalent was less the practical management of the system than the emotional and psychological context in which it was experienced. New Zealanders rationing butter in a country that produced it in abundance were making a choice, however constrained by government policy, that carried a different moral and emotional weight from the choice made by a British housewife for whom the butter ration was a genuine and sometimes painful limitation on what she could provide for her family. The awareness of this difference was present in New Zealand's wartime public discourse, and the government's communications were careful to acknowledge it, framing New Zealand's rationing not as a response to domestic need but as a form of practical solidarity with the people of Britain, to whom New Zealand's food exports were making a direct and measurable contribution to survival. Solidarity, freely chosen and genuinely meant. Fact 83. Mineral supplements and fortified foods became a significant component of British wartime food policy in ways that represented one of the most direct applications of contemporary nutritional science to practical food management. The decision to fortify the national loaf with calcium carbonate, added to compensate for the reduced calcium content of the higher extraction flour from which it was made, was taken on the advice of nutritional scientists who had calculated that the shift away from white bread would reduce civilian calcium intake to levels that might produce measurable health consequences over time. The addition of vitamins to margarine, compensating for the absence of naturally occurring vitamins present in butter, was similarly driven by scientific calculation rather than consumer preference. These fortification decisions were made and implemented without significant public discussion. They were administrative choices by government scientists and Ministry of Food officials, applied to the food supply without the knowledge or consent of the consumers eating the fortified products. This represented a significant and largely unremarked expansion of the government's role in directly managing the nutritional content of the civilian diet, an intervention justified by the emergency conditions of wartime but that established precedents for food fortification policy extending into the post-war period, and continuing to influence food regulation in Britain and many other countries to the present day. A quiet intervention, made in urgency, whose consequences outlasted the urgency by generations. Fact 84. Pork kept in backyards and on small holdings across Britain through the pig-keeping movement represented one of the most practically significant forms of civilian food self-sufficiency that the wartime emergency produced. The government actively encouraged pig-keeping as a means of converting food waste, kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, stale bread, and other household refuse, into high-quality protein. Pig clubs were established in towns and cities across the country through which groups of neighbors collectively kept and fed a pig, sharing the resulting meat among themselves when the animal was eventually slaughtered. By 1942, there were estimated to be over 4,000 pig clubs operating in Britain, collectively keeping a significant number of animals and producing a genuine supplementary contribution to civilian meat supply. The practical aspects of urban and suburban pig keeping were not always straightforward. Pigs are demanding animals that require consistent care, produce significant quantities of waste, and can generate noise and smell that neighbors did not always receive with unlimited enthusiasm. But the pig clubs also generated a form of community organization and shared practical purpose that had social value beyond the bacon they eventually produced, creating ongoing cooperative structures that brought together people who might otherwise have had little reason to interact, and giving them a common project whose progress they could follow, argue about, and one day together quietly celebrate. Fact 85. Throughout the wartime rationing period, children's literature and educational materials were quietly but consistently updated to reflect the new realities of the civilian food environment, shaping how an entire generation of young people understood the relationship between food, society, and individual responsibility. School textbooks were revised to include material on nutrition, food production, and the importance of avoiding waste. Storybooks and comics for children incorporated characters who grew victory gardens, saved their sweet rations sensibly, and helped their mothers manage the household food budget. The Beano and Dandy comics, both enormously popular with British children during the war years, incorporated wartime food themes with varying degrees of didactic intent and narrative grace. The accumulated effect of this cultural messaging, delivered through every medium that reached children, from the classroom to the comic strip, was the formation of a generation whose baseline assumptions about food included a moral dimension that their pre-war predecessors had not shared. Food was not simply something you ate because you wanted it. It was a resource that had to be managed responsibly, shared equitably, and never wasted. These values, instilled during childhood under conditions of genuine scarcity, proved remarkably durable, persisting in the behavior and attitudes of the wartime generation long after the scarcity that had given them their urgency had passed, a lesson taught by difficulty and remembered for life. Fact 86. Wartime food rationing produced some of its most significant and lasting effects not in what it restricted but in what it inadvertently created. The infrastructure, institutions, and habits of collective food management that survived the emergency and became permanent features of the post-war social landscape. The network of local food offices established to administer the rationing system employed tens of thousands of civil servants who developed expertise in food supply management, price control, and nutritional policy that had not previously existed as a professional discipline within the British government. The Women's Voluntary Service, which played a central role in operating British restaurants, distributing emergency food supplies, and supporting communities during and after bombing raids, emerged from the war as a permanent institution with a broad remit for community welfare that extended far beyond food provision. The cooperative structures established among neighbors for shared cooking, pig keeping, jam making, and allotment cultivation did not all survive the return of commercial food abundance, but enough of them persisted in modified forms to leave a genuine mark on the social organization of the communities where they had been established. The wartime food emergency had required the creation of new institutions and new practices, and some of those institutions and practices turned out to be valuable enough to keep a legacy of the rationing years that operated quietly and persistently in the background of post-war British social life. For decades that followed a crisis most of the world was glad to have left behind. Fact 87. Wartime rationing created a specific and previously largely non-existent social role for the male shopper in British households, as the pressures of managing a home under rationing sometimes required both members of a couple to participate in food acquisition in ways that pre-war domestic arrangements had not anticipated or required. Men who had previously left all food shopping to their wives found themselves, during the war years, standing in queues at butchers and greengrocers, either because their wives were working in war industries and could not manage the shopping during business hours, or because the length of the queues required multiple family members to stand in different lines simultaneously to secure different items before supplies ran out. The male shopper navigating the wartime food queue was a figure of some social comedy at the time, frequently depicted in cartoons as hopelessly incompetent, uncertain of what to ask for, and bewildered by the requirements of the ration book. The reality was more nuanced. Many men who took on shopping responsibilities during the war years developed a genuine competence and engagement with the food supply that they had not previously needed to exercise, and the experience changed, for at least some of them, the domestic gender dynamics around food in ways that were small but real. small but real, and pointing, tentatively and imperfectly, toward the more shared domestic arrangements that later decades would come to regard as simply the way things ought to be. Fact 88. Among the many material legacies of the wartime rationing years, the physical condition of the cookware and kitchen equipment used by civilian households tells its own quiet story of sustained use and careful maintenance. Metal kitchen equipment, pots, pans, baking tins, was difficult to replace during the war years because the metals required for their manufacture had been redirected to military production. Households whose equipment wore out or was damaged had limited options for replacement, and the management and maintenance of existing cookware became a domestic skill in its own right. Cast iron pots that developed cracks were repaired rather than replaced. Baking tins that had rusted were restored through techniques that peacetime households would simply have bypassed in favor of a cheap replacement. The itinerant knife grinder and pot mender, figures who had been declining in the pre-war decades as cheap manufactured goods made their services less economically attractive, experienced a revival of business during the war years, as households sought to extend the useful life of equipment that could not easily be replaced. The culture of repair and maintenance that the wartime scarcity of kitchen equipment produced was another expression of the broader wartime reorientation away from the disposability of peacetime consumption and toward a relationship with material objects that valued their continued usefulness above the novelty of replacement. Things were mended carefully and faithfully because they had to be, and in that mending something of value was quietly preserved. Fact 89. Food parcels sent from relatives in rural areas or from overseas connections became some of the most emotionally significant items of wartime correspondence, combining the practical value of their contents with a depth of personal feeling that transformed them from simple packages into genuine acts of love expressed in edible form. A food parcel arriving from a Canadian or Australian relative to a British family enduring the full weight of wartime rationing was opened with a ceremony and an emotional intensity that peacetime gift-giving rarely matched. The contents, tinned fruit, real butter, sugar, chocolate, dried fruit, represented not only their practical nutritional value but the thought, effort and affection of the person who had assembled and sent them across thousands of miles of ocean. British families receiving these parcels frequently described the experience in terms that go well beyond the practical, the unwrapping as an event shared by the whole household, each item held up and examined before being put away, the deliberate, careful decision about when and how each precious component would be used. Children who received food parcels from overseas relatives they had never met developed, through these packages, a sense of connection to those distant people that letters alone could not have produced. A relationship mediated by taste, by sweetness, by the specific and immediate pleasure of eating something that someone far away had chosen and sent with care. Love made edible, carried across an ocean, and unwrapped in a quiet kitchen by people who would never forget it. Fact 90. Wartime rationing's effect on the British fishing communities of the north and west of the country produced a set of economic and social pressures that affected not only the fishing industry itself, but the coastal communities that depended on it in complex and interrelated ways. With much of the deep-sea fishing fleet requisitioned for naval service and the remaining vessels operating under the constant threat of mines and air attack, the income and employment base of fishing communities contracted sharply. The men who remained, too old for naval service or working in the reduced civilian fleet, fished waters that had become genuinely dangerous. The families waiting for them ashore carried a specific anxiety that combined the ordinary wartime worry of separation with the particular fear of men working in mined and contested waters. The fish they brought back was a significant contribution to the national protein supply at a time when the fishing industry's output was critical to civilian nutrition. But the communities producing it were themselves living with a specific combination of economic pressure, physical danger, and social disruption that the national narrative of wartime solidarity sometimes obscured. The contribution of fishing communities to wartime civilian nutrition was real and significant, and the cost at which that contribution was made, measured in lost boats, dangerous working conditions, and the steady anxiety of communities waiting on shore, was one that deserved more recognition than it typically received. Some contributions are made quietly, far from view, and quietly forgotten. That does not make them any less real. Fact 91. Wartime recipe innovations that emerged from the specific constraints of rationing occasionally produced culinary discoveries that had genuine merit entirely independent of the emergency conditions that had generated them. The enforced experimentation with wholemeal flour, alternative fats, and reduced sugar formulations produced, among the many indifferent results, some baked goods and prepared dishes that were genuinely superior to their pre-war equivalents in nutritional terms and in some cases in flavor as well. Doris Grant's wholemeal loaf, developed during the war years as a response to the difficulty of baking a satisfactory loaf from the coarse flour available, became a genuinely beloved recipe that remained in continuous use long after white flour was freely available again, kept in circulation not by necessity but by the preferences of people who had discovered in the context of wartime constraint that they actually preferred it. The wartime discovery that vegetable-based dishes could be satisfying and flavorful in their own right, rather than simply inadequate substitutes for meat, quietly challenged assumptions about the necessity of animal protein in a satisfying diet that had not previously been seriously questioned in mainstream British food culture. These culinary discoveries were small and their impact was gradual, but they were genuine and lasting additions to the domestic food repertoire that the rationing years had produced, amid all their difficulties and deprivations, as an unexpected and entirely unplanned creative legacy. Fact 92. Children who had grown up under rationing and who came of age in the relative abundance of the 1950s occupied an unusual psychological position with respect to food, shaped by the contrast between the scarcity they remembered and the plenty they were now experiencing, and complicated by a set of habits and attitudes that did not always translate smoothly from one context to the other. The instinct against waste, formed in genuine scarcity, continued to operate in a world where waste had become economically possible and socially normalized. The preference for simple, filling food over elaborate or decorative cuisine, formed in years when the available ingredients had dictated simplicity, persisted as a taste preference long after more varied and elaborate food became available and affordable. Some members of this generation described a specific discomfort with abundance that they could not always rationally justify, a slight unease at a fully loaded table, a persistent impulse to save rather than spend food resources, a difficulty in taking plenty for granted that distinguished them quietly and consistently from the generation that came after them. These were not neurotic responses. They were the entirely logical outcomes of having formed one's fundamental relationship with food during years when food was genuinely scarce, and of carrying that formation into a world that had changed more rapidly than the habits built inside it. The scarcity had ended, but its shape, pressed gently into character, remained. Fact 93. Wartime rationing produced a generation of British men who had spent their military service eating institutional food, army rations, naval catering, RAF mess meals, and who returned to civilian life with food preferences and expectations that had been shaped by years of eating in mass catering environments rather than domestic kitchens. The transition from institutional to domestic eating was not always smooth. Men who had spent 4 or 5 years eating whatever the army provided, reliably filling if rarely delicious, returned to households where food was still limited by rationing, where their wives had developed their own wartime cooking practices and preferences, and where the expectation was that they would fit into a domestic food routine that had evolved entirely without them. Some men found the return to domestic eating genuinely difficult to adjust to, not because the food was worse than the army's, but because the social and contextual dimensions of eating had changed completely. Others found in the domestic meal a warmth and a personal attention that institutional catering could never provide. The simple experience of sitting down to a meal cooked specifically for them by someone who knew their preferences was something they described, in post-war accounts, with a gratitude whose intensity spoke to how completely that simple domestic pleasure had been missed. A meal made for you, by someone who loved you, was not simply a meal. It was, after everything, something close to the whole reason they had come home. Fact 94. Throughout the war, the management of food at the household level was fundamentally a management of time as well as of ingredients, and the time demands of wartime cooking fell almost exclusively on women in ways that the government's communications around rationing rarely fully acknowledged. Producing nutritious meals from rationed ingredients required significantly more time than producing equivalent meals from well-stocked peacetime pantries. More time in queues acquiring the ingredients, more time in preparation, converting cheaper and less convenient cuts into something edible, more time in the actual cooking, as the slow methods required by tough cuts or dried pulses replaced the quicker preparations available when better ingredients were at hand. This additional time demand was occurring simultaneously with an expansion of women's other responsibilities: war work, civil defense duties, the management of children's evacuations, the emotional labor of maintaining family stability under wartime pressure. The women who managed all of this rarely described their own achievement in heroic terms, because the culture of the time did not offer them the language for it. But the practical accomplishment of keeping families fed and nourished through years of rationing, under the full weight of wartime's additional demands, was a form of sustained competence that deserved, and deserves, still, far more recognition than it has typically received in accounts of what the war required, and who it was that provided it, quietly, every single day. Fact 95. The social history of the humble carrot during the Second World War is one of the more unlikely stories that the wartime food record contains, and it speaks with surprising clarity to the relationship between government communication, civilian culture, and the management of food supply under wartime conditions. Carrots became surplus in Britain during the early war years, as the dramatic expansion of domestic vegetable production under the Dig for Victory campaign generated more carrots than the civilian population was accustomed to consuming. The Ministry of Food's response was a promotional campaign of remarkable creative ambition, featuring the cartoon characters Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete, promoting carrot-based recipes in national newspapers and on BBC radio, and culminating in the promotion of carrot on a stick as a festival treat at a time when sweets were rationed. The campaign also propagated, whether deliberately or accidentally remains a matter of historical debate, the story that British Royal Air Force pilots' exceptional night vision was the result of eating large quantities of carrots. The claim was nutritionally implausible, but it served the dual purpose of encouraging carrot consumption and concealing from German intelligence the actual source of British pilots' improved nighttime accuracy, the recently developed radar technology. The carrot story became one of the most durable and widely believed food myths of the entire war, persisting in popular understanding long after its origins in wartime propaganda had been quietly and completely forgotten. Fact 96. Post-war austerity, the continuation of rationing and food scarcity into the late 1940s and early 1950s in Britain, tested the psychological reserves of a civilian population that had genuinely believed the end of the war would bring the end of restriction, and the disappointment of that expectation produced a specific and politically significant form of civilian exhaustion. The Labour government elected in 1945 had come to power on a platform of social transformation and had implemented the foundational programs of the British welfare state, but it had done so while continuing to manage an austerity economy that the war's financial and material legacy made genuinely unavoidable. The continued rationing of bread in 1946, the ongoing restrictions on meat, the persistent shortage of housing and consumer goods, all of this occurred against a backdrop of genuine social progress that the government was making simultaneously, creating a paradox that its communications struggled to effectively explain. British civilians who had sustained themselves through the war years with the expectation of post-war relief found that relief, when it came, arrived more slowly and more partially than they had imagined. The patience required to endure post-war austerity was in some ways more demanding than the patience required during the war itself, because the moral clarity that had sustained wartime sacrifice had been replaced by a peace that was real, but that felt in its material dimensions uncomfortably similar to the war it had followed. Fact 97. Wartime food rationing left its mark on the English language in ways that are still faintly visible in the idioms and expressions of everyday speech. Phrases that originated or gained their widest currency during the rationing years: making do, doing without, stretching it further, using it up, carry within them the specific economic philosophy of the rationing period, and their persistence in common usage speaks to the depth with which that philosophy embedded itself in the culture of the generation that lived through it. The word spam, originally a brand name for the canned pork product that became ubiquitous in the wartime diet, has survived the disappearance of the product from most British diets to acquire an entirely new meaning in the digital age, carrying within its new context a faint echo of the wartime associations of the unwanted. the unavoidable, and the relentlessly recurring that the original product had generated in the people who ate it throughout the rationing years. Utility, a word that became associated during the war with the government's range of standardized, undecorated, functional consumer goods produced under wartime material restrictions, retained for decades afterward a connotation of functional adequacy that balanced somewhat uneasily between approbation and mild damnation. The rationing years shaped not only what people ate and how they managed their households, but also in small but persistent ways, the language through which they described and understood the material world around them, words that carry the memory of scarcity, still in use, still quietly traveling. Fact 98. Wartime food rationing's influence on the development of the post-war supermarket in Britain operated through a set of connections that are rarely drawn explicitly but that are genuinely significant when examined carefully. The rationing system had accustomed British consumers to a relationship with food retail organized around entitlement and allocation rather than free choice, a relationship in which the primary question was not what you wanted, but what you were permitted to have. When rationing ended and the consumer market for food was gradually restored, the transition towards self-service food retail, in which customers moved through a shop selecting goods from shelves rather than presenting requests across a counter, represented not only an economic efficiency innovation but a genuine cultural shift in the experience of food shopping. The supermarket offered something that the rationing years had made feel genuinely novel: the freedom to choose, the abundance of options, the physical experience of a shop that presented plenty rather than managed scarcity. The emotional resonance of this experience for consumers who remembered the rationing years was significant, and it contributed to the rapid adoption of supermarket shopping in Britain during the 1950s and 1960s. The supermarket's success was built partly on efficiency and price, but partly also on the specific and powerful appeal it held for a generation whose most recent shopping experience had been organized around a ration book, a counter, and the quiet weekly arithmetic of making less do more. Fact 99. Wartime cooking innovations developed under the pressure of rationing occasionally found their way into the professional culinary world in ways that their domestic origins did not always make obvious. The intense focus on vegetable cookery that rationing had driven among civilian home cooks produced, in Britain and across occupied Europe, a practical knowledge base about the preparation and flavoring of vegetables that professional kitchens had not previously needed to develop with equivalent depth. The enforced attention to the specific qualities of different vegetables, their textures at different cooking stages, the flavor combinations that worked best with limited seasoning resources, the techniques that made simple ingredients genuinely satisfying, produced a generation of home cooks whose knowledge of vegetable preparation was considerably more sophisticated than their pre-war equivalents. Some of this knowledge filtered upward into professional cookery through the natural movement of people between domestic and professional cooking environments, and the gradual elevation of vegetable cookery within British professional cuisine that occurred over the post-war decades was shaped, at least in part, by the practical knowledge base that the wartime emergency had generated in the domestic kitchen. The rationing years were not, by any reasonable measure, a golden age of British cuisine, but they were, unexpectedly and without anyone having planned it that way, a significant period of practical culinary education for the population that lived through them, knowledge earned in difficulty, and carried quietly forward. Fact 100. Something that the people who designed Britain's wartime rationing system did not anticipate, and that researchers studying its outcomes only gradually came to appreciate, was the extent to which the equalization of nutritional access that rationing produced had measurable effects on the health of social classes that had previously been chronically undernourished. Working-class children in pre-war Britain were, by a range of measures, significantly less well-nourished than their middle-class counterparts, shorter in stature, more susceptible to certain diseases, and more likely to show clinical signs of specific nutritional deficiencies. The wartime rationing system, by establishing minimum nutritional entitlements that applied to everyone regardless of income, effectively raised the nutritional floor for the most deprived sections of the population while constraining the ceiling for the most affluent. The result was a compression of nutritional inequality that produced measurable health improvements at the bottom of the social scale, improvements that were, by certain indicators, more significant than those achievable through medical intervention alone. This was not what the rationing system had been designed to do. It had been designed to manage wartime scarcity fairly, not to address the structural nutritional inequalities of peacetime British society. That it achieved the latter as a byproduct of the former was one of the most significant and least celebrated outcomes of the entire wartime food management program, and one whose implications for post-war welfare policy were recognized and acted upon by the architects of the welfare state that followed. Fact 101. When the last ration book was finally surrendered in Britain in 1954 and the 9-year chapter of wartime and post-war rationing officially closed, what remained was not simply a population that had been through a difficult period and was glad to have it behind them. What remained was a generation permanently shaped by the specific experience of having managed their most basic daily needs, feeding themselves, feeding their families, producing and preserving and sharing food within a framework of collective obligation and genuine scarcity. They had learned in the most practical and daily possible way that food was not simply a consumer commodity but a shared resource whose management had moral dimensions that the market alone could not adequately address. They had discovered that equitable distribution of scarcity was both possible and socially valuable. They had found in the constraints of the ration book a discipline that was externally imposed but internally absorbed, a set of habits and values around food that became, over the years of practice, genuinely their own. What the rationing years had taken from this generation, the pleasures of abundance, the freedom of unrestricted choice, the simple unconscious enjoyment of eating without calculation, was real, and the relief at its recovery was real. But what those years had given them, a practical wisdom about food, a moral seriousness about waste and equity, a knowledge of what it meant to manage carefully and share generously, was equally real. And in the long, quiet accounting of what the war had cost and what it had produced, it deserves its own honest and lasting recognition. There is something unexpectedly intimate about the history of food rationing. Wars are usually told through their largest movements, the armies, the leaders, the turning points that change the direction of everything. But rationing insists on smallness. It insists on the specific. It brings history down to the level of a kitchen table, a ration book, a woman standing in a queue before dawn in the cold, a child eating a birthday cake made from dried egg and saved butter, and a mother's quiet determination to give them something worth remembering. That is where this story has lived, in these 101 facts, not in policy documents or economic analyses, but in the daily, physical, entirely human experience of trying to feed people you love with what a war had left you. What is striking, sitting with all of this, is how much of the civilian wartime experience was organized around food, not around battles or politics or the movements of armies, but around the far more ancient and urgent question of whether there would be enough to eat, and how to make it go further, and who would go without if there was not sufficient for everyone. These questions are as old as human civilization, and the war stripped away everything that modern abundance had layered over them, leaving them as present and as pressing as they had been in any earlier age of human history. The people who lived through the rationing years were, in this sense, living closer to the fundamental conditions of human existence than their pre-war comfort had required them to live, and the experience changed them in ways that ran deeper than habit or preference, reaching down into the most basic layers of how they understood their relationship to food, to community, and to one another. One of the things that the rationing years demonstrated most clearly was that scarcity, equitably managed, produced something different from the scarcity of market failure or social indifference. When everyone was operating within the same constraints, when the ration book was the universal currency of the kitchen regardless of social position or income, when the government's stated intention was to ensure that no one starved while others had more than enough, the experience of going without was different in kind from the experience of poverty.